This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast, episode 105. And we are back in studio. We're going to continue on with Randall. Were we still talking about the sun?
We were talking about the sun. Yeah, it changes in the sun. Yes, we were. And we could pick up on that theme. Been kind of focusing, we focus so much time on the late glacial maximum, the younger, driest period to transition out. And I've always felt like I've been neglecting the Holocene. But now since I've been working with you guys, and you guys are the Holocene working group.
We are.
Yeah.
The Holocene, yeah.
I feel like that it's time to remedy that neglect and look further into it. So I think, weren't we talking about the sun kind of in the context of some of the changes that we've actually seen during the Holocene?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's worth looking into in more detail because, God, there's so much interesting stuff coming out that nobody was even imagining 10 years ago.
Yo, is that Greg?
It's really confirming.
Sorry, I'm just trying to align my
what I would call
camera. I
the
can't see the
dynamic
chat.
model of Earth history.
Yo, Big Greg, what up? Yo, Big Eric, what's up,
Stable
bros?
model of Earth history.
Yo, legends
Now,
in
of
chat.
course,
What's up, guys?
What I think the record that we're now putting together
you doing?
shows that there are periods of stability, of course.
Welcome.
But they are
Thanks for being here.
quite frequently, as it turns out, interrupted
Greg and Eric, both legends.
by various kinds of convulsions and upheavals and disasters and
Friday
catastrophes
night
and cataclysms
addiction.
and what have you.
So
Aztec
I have a
addiction.
question about
What's up?
this
Yo,
because,
thanks, man.
in general, the millions of layers that you'll see, especially in sedimentary rocks.
Oh my god,
Sometimes
we
each
have
one
had
of those layers may be a
9
small layer we
big
consider.
room
It
tragedies.
encompasses a large amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's
does
encouraging.
incorporating more and more catastrophic events
Where we
in
passed
Earth's
away
history,
on a
would
PB
that
pace
shrink that time or make those
with
layers
hopes of
actually
survival.
many of them put down quickly and so they don't represent as
Man.
much time?
Oh, sure.
Like,
And
does that mean
Good,
that,
thanks, buddy.
that stratigraphic
How are you, man?
style dating
Thanks
would
for-
have to be completely reworked?
You know, you're a busy man.
some
You got
cases.
no, I don't.
you got your
well,
family.
in some
You got a
cases,
4-year-old
perhaps, yes. I
now.
don't think
Yeah.
overall. I mean, because you've got
I appreciate
the
you
whole
stopping into
succession of
my stream. I really do.
layers there
'Cause you're the
that
man.
represent different time periods, and they can be correlated over vast geographic areas, essentially by
Oh
the
man, I went too
fossils that are
far.
found
You see
in-
that? That was terrible.
Right,
And
but
so-
how are the fossils dated?
It's really bad.
Well,
Right.
that's up to this point, up until recently, those fossils were dated
Doing well, thanks,
by
buddy. It means a lot.
essentially just guesswork.
Okay.
You had a let's see, what was it? You've got an absolute time chronology, and then you've got a
I
relative
feel like I'm just so
time
focused on this
So,
PB.
The first thing that happened in the first
It's a
century or
lot.
so of geology or more is that this relative stratigraphy
Nice,
was
man, but
worked
it's so
out.
rewarding, man.
And of course, it's constantly being refined and improved.
4-year-old,
and they
that's
have these
amazing, buddy.
conferences quite regularly
Winning
where
Emmys.
They want to update the geological time record.
Raising
And perhaps,
sons.
one of the most recent things is making those adjustments to what we used to call the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, now to the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. Because they've been tweaking and adjusting.
yeah, it's
the
minus
periods in
like
there.
20
So
Celsius
I'm
right
so
now. I think
still, for me, it's still
it's pretty
the
cold. It sucks, but
Cretaceous Tertiary, the KT boundary.
I did ice skating
Because
yesterday.
they've gone to the
I
Cretaceous
did an ice skating
Paleogene, now
outdoor
it's
hockey
K,
stream.
and then a capitalized
Chill,
T
yeah.
and a small case G.
It's pretty
That
standard
just
for
to me is
Ottawa.
getting way too complicated.
Ottawa Januaries are always
KT,
just so
yeah.
freaking cold.
KT, damn it, not this KPG.
It was
thing.
sunny today.
But
So- So across
That
the
helps
world,
a lot.
you can correlate different layers by saying, this layer over here on this continent has these fossils in it, and
Yeah.
over here on a completely
fuck,
different
man?
continent we see the same fossils, so we can say these must be from the same time
hate
period
this
since they have the same
raining,
life
man.
form.
yeah, and what now is before
You
the
missed it?
idea
Oh, no
was
worries, man.
you looked at the
Yeah, it's in my
various
highlight. Or
periods
not, well, yeah.
in
It's in my old
geological
videos, but it's all good.
history, and there were the
I'll probably
things
do it
called
again.
disconformities
Outdoor
and
hockey.
unconformities. Let's see.
I was the only one, though.
I
There was no
got this.
nets either.
Used to know this, but Kyle, would you look up the word disconformity?
So,
And there's
All right.
so what happens is that
I just
you'll have
skated
a
around.
layer, and then a lot of it gets eroded away, and there
thanks,
might
buddy.
be
Thanks
this
for your
gap
interest.
in the
Yeah.
in
I
the
figured
rock
you'd be
record.
interested, maybe.
So what is now a thin layer may not have originally been a thin layer, may have been much thicker. And
Thanks,
due
man.
to a
Thanks, buddy. I was gonna put it on
disconformity
YouTube, but
or
I mean, I don't do anything. I just skate around.
It's
Some-
a disconformity. It's a buried, erosional,
does show-
or non-deposition surface or
You know where I play
boundary
basketball? It's now
between
completely
parallel rock
frozen with
layers
ice.
of different ages.
Yeah, so what was, say the first part again?
A buried, erosional, or non-deposition surface.
Okay. A
Or
buried,
boundary.
yeah. So what I was just describing
right.
then would have been a disconformity. So it's been eroded. So the surface that is there was not the original surface. So now you have another deposition layer on top of that. And so you've got some indeterminate hiatus of time that transpired there that you can't work out. But here's the thing, you may have this succession. And if you can see, you go this
Dude, I saw you
limestone
beat
layer with
Statue
certain
DLTK,
ages of
that's
certain
insane.
kinds of fossils, and then that
I
becomes
was lurking
a
in your
layer of
grind for that.
sandstone, and then that becomes a layer of shale. Well, you can kind of figure out there that, well, you go from
You seemed so sure that you weren't gonna get a
limestone to
completion.
sandstone to shale. You're looking at a rising
It didn't look like you were
sea
gonna get a
level,
completion
and then
either, to be
you
honest.
might see something,
Not the
you
heat.
know, that now includes what would be terrigenous sediments, which is stuff that's coming from land, right? So now you know
Stratch
that
is so
the
wacky,
sea
man.
level is going back down. If you've got shale, shale is going to be very prevalent in
Like-
a
like
near
impressive wacky,
shore
not
or
foolish
coastal
wacky,
type
though.
environment where you have a lot of swampy type stuff. Like if
Yeah,
you're out on the
wonky.
coastal plain in the southeast, or down in the Delta region of Louisiana, along the Gulf Coast, places like that, you're gonna see you've got a lot of swamps, a lot of marshes, and so
Come on,
they
why?
tend to produce shale,
Why?
often shale
Who?
with plant fossils still in there, right? But where you get a
PD
muddy
Gen.
type of deposit,
Yeah.
and then it might shift to sand, and then it might shift to limestone. Well, that's what would happen if you've got the sea
Well, you did
there,
it.
limestone is being formed, and then you've got a beach
Sand.
with sand, right? And then the sea level rises, and so now that sandstone will become, depending on how long the sea is up at that level, now it'll begin to deposit calcium carbonate based stuff that forms limestone. So now you got a sandstone with a limestone, and then let's say that the sea level goes back down. So then you're going to have more sandstone, and it keeps going down, and so the coast is following, the land, the terrigenous stuff is
Oh, wow,
following
insane.
the coastline. So now you have land over that. So
Are
you
there
go
not
through
infinite
those
gardens? How
succession
did
of
you do
fossils
that?
Like that. So now you go
Wow, that's
somewhere
crazy.
1,000 miles away. You see, oh, look, here's the limestone with the same fossils in it, and then it's got that similar sandstone over it, and you can see the same succession. And so now you correlate, and you kind of do that piece by piece, going around,
That's
and
really
eventually
impressive.
now they've worked out, or are in
guess
the
I have to watch
process
the
of
run.
working out. And this comes under the heading of historical geology. That's what this would be called, historical
Terrain?
geology.
Are you
I will
serious?
admit,
Wow.
I'm rusty on my historical geology, even though I took courses in it. That was 30 years ago. And I don't use structural geology
Control?
unless it's a specific.
Wow,
like if we're going to go
champion,
do a tour, now there we're going to look at a lot of that historical geology because, when we were doing the Cumberland tour, or when we do the tours out west, we do scab lands now.
Holy, are you
It's all
serious?
pretty much
You're-
all
wow,
basalt,
you're a legend, man.
right?
Right.
And
And
That's
so
crazy.
And you've told us in the Scablands, for example, how old that basalt is supposed
That's
to
amazing.
be. So how are they checking that? Are they doing radiometric dating of some kind?
There is, yes, radiometric dating, and we're going to have to do a special episode, a special edition at some point where we talk
That's
about
truly
just
amazing,
dating. And
Eric.
I know you got a lot of good stuff, and you've studied into some of the dating. And, the dating methodology is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And I'm behind on it. I need to catch up
crazy,
on some of
bro.
the new types of dating and how
That's
they're
really crazy.
corroborating and calibrating those dates.
It's been fun, yeah.
But But they are. There's
been fun
various
watching.
ways you have to check and cross-check dates to understand if these are actually accurate depictions. And of course, some of those datings, you know, the radioactive dating from the
I
various
filled my times
rocks
page
and
finally
minerals,
for GoldenEye.
that can have a pretty wide.
I have times
plus and
on all
minus
60
range.
levels
yeah, it's
now.
huge margin of error. And
Right,
proud of
in
that.
general, and in general, the older it is, the wider the
Thanks,
margin.
man.
It's a percentage-based thing.
It's yeah.
Yeah.
Still lacking. No,
However,
it's
now, like,
you know, it's
with
whatever.
the KT boundary, the
It's meaningless, but I learned a lot of the
Um,
levels like
you know,
Caverns
that-
SA. Wow,
that has been
such a
refined
ridiculous level.
to, you know,
Cavern Secret
65
Agent might be the
plus
most
million
ridiculous
years ago
level
to,
in the
like,
game.
66.6 million years. So now we're getting
But
pretty
the
precise
scientists, oh my god,
to date that Cretaceous Tertiary layer.
it's just so
Precision.
bad. It's
How
just
did
so
they-
silly. It's
To
just a
within a
silly
million
level.
years.
Yeah,
Did you say 666?
Hey,
it's just
come on,
so
come on, let's-
dumb with the scientists, man.
Too many jokes. Too fast. Too soon.
right,
Okay, sorry.
I was just processing the first joke, and then suddenly I was assaulted with the second joke. So
Yeah, it is fun.
Yeah, I'm just interested in this concept of.
I mean,
you know,
the
if we have
scientists,
to-
man.
If the
It's like Dumb and
understanding of
Dumber.
climate, the effect of
Oh,
the sun
sorry,
on the
man.
Earth, the amount of impacts and you know, bolide explosions that the Earth gets, if that increases, and that shows that there's been more catastrophes, then I'm just interested in how that will shift or change the appearance of the age of the dating of some of these layers. I mean, obviously it's not going to have effect on the magma stuff so much, but it is going to change ideas about the sedimentary stuff, because you can have enormous amounts of sediment moved in very short amount of time
right.
in a catastrophic event, and it might look like something that took millions and millions of years to lay down, but it's actually was laid down in 2 weeks or a month
Yeah.
or maybe 100 years, right?
Yes, yes. And one of the things I was going to try to point I was going to make is kind of the shifting in the way you look at that stratigraphy. Is that early on the idea was it was not assumed that catastrophic events were global in extent, that they were just regional. Now, how that affects the thinking is this: if it's just regional and you're seeing a cataclysm that's just in a local or a regional area, it has no bearing on the global synthesis, right? Whereas if it's a global catastrophe,
Oh my
it's
gosh,
gonna-
is Eric
it-
still
it
watching
essentially, by
ads? Sorry,
definition,
man.
and is leaving
Back,
imprint
nice.
all over the planet. Now that
Was he saying,
becomes a
yeah,
data
silly
that
silly
you can
game.
use
Have dropped soon?
to
No worries, man.
correlate things on a
Just that
broad
level's pretty
scale,
silly.
and has just the opposite effect
scientists.
of a local catastrophe that's going to disrupt and confuse the issue of
Yeah.
trying to correlate strata across great distances. And that's part of what has happened, say, since the
all
1980s,
good.
1990s, is the recognition of global scale events
Nice, man.
and the incorporation of that into one's thinking about
you playing tonight?
chronostratigraphy, which is the whole process of dating. So now it's recognized, well, yeah,
Good
we
movement,
have
yeah.
global events like the KT iridium layer is global in extent. So wherever you can find that, you know that now you're looking at a synchronous. This layer in New Zealand was laid down at the
I would
same
not
time
want to
as this
run
corresponding layer in
a
Denmark,
secret
and this one
agent
in Italy,
speed run though.
or this
A
one now
full
in China,
game.
or wherever it happens
That
to
would
be.
be not
So now
fun.
you've got this widespread global datum that you can use that becomes a major reference, rather than
I guess
the
double O,
difference
it's the
being that if
same.
it was just a local catastrophe, then any kind of correlating you did anywhere else with that is actually going to introduce more error into your models of the chronology, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so what that entailed then was a shift, whereas if you've got a strata, however thick it is, from a few feet to maybe even hundreds of feet, and it's clear that you've got a disconformity or an unconformity or something happened that bookends that, right? And your assumption is that those are probably just regional events that are only going to be visible at this particular fascia, at this particular outcrop, at this particular place. So what you do is you don't look at those, you look at the middle, where you're trying to focus on the part of the strata where nothing was happening out of the ordinary. Whereas
What is
now we're in a
this?
different position because since the last, say, 30 to 40 years, there's been a much greater recognition of global scale events. So now the focus is shifting away from looking at the places within a stratigraphic section where nothing happened to the points in the column where something happened. See? And that's a major shift in how we think about the Earth. You know, and I think there's probably an old school of geology that's still, you know, looking at that gradualistic mode primarily, but like
Oh
you
my
just were
gosh.
talking about, Russ,
We're
I mean,
close, though.
that's-
We're so
that's
close.
the recognition that we're at now is that, yeah, there are these events that vastly accelerate the process, whether it's a depositional process.
What am I gonna go
or whether
after
it's an
when I
erosion
get,
process.
if and when I
Of
get
course,
this
they're
time?
correlated because if you've got
Lost
a
my
major
stream.
erosional event, that means that forces of nature, probably water being the primary one, are removing material from one area and putting it somewhere
Thanks, man.
else.
I think
So a major
Bunker 1,
erosional
Secret
event
Agent,
will often
23
coincide or
attempts.
correlate with a major depositional event, exactly as
Probably
the
not what
thing
you were thinking,
we've
but-
been seeing in our tours in the slamlands and so on.
What was it? Unconformity is what you said?
The other one was unconformity, and there's a
Dude, I don't
slight
know.
variation
Runway
in the
22
difference in the meaning.
does
And if
not
Kyle
look
would be so
interesting.
good as to look up
Or fun.
unconformity.
So what was
Huh.
the first one? A
Disconformity.
disconformity. Okay. Because I think because here where we live, the Edwards Plateau area, it's an uplifted. Go ahead.
Unconformity is a break.
Yeah,
in the
probably Bunker
geologic
1,
record
Secret Agent,
caused by a
23.
period of erosion or a pause in sediment accumulation, followed by the deposition of sediments anew.
How is that different from
That's
disconformity?
overdue.
I'm going
Followed
back.
by more sediments being deposited
A pause in sediment accumulation,
pause.
rather than erosional.
followed by the deposition of
A
sediments
pause
anew.
rather than an erosional event.
But it does say a break in the
Why don't I do
geologic
more
record caused
full
by a
game
period
runs, too?
Of erosion or
Yeah,
a pause.
yeah.
Sounds
they're
like it's the
close.
same material.
Double O
where
agent,
the
sub 1 hour.
disconformity was then overlaid by a different material.
This says, yeah, the other one is a buried erosional or non-deposition surface or boundary
Okay, so
between
it-
parallel rock layers of different ages.
So it has to be buried. So yeah. So here we have Glen Rose Formation is exposed in a lot of places, and that's like lower Cretaceous.
Okay.
But it is the surface now in a lot of places.
Yeah. So that means that a lot of stuff post
It's gone.
Cretaceous is
Yeah.
gone. Yeah.
Yes, because if you go off the plateau, right, and into the lowlands surrounding it, it's all that material is there, and so the
Aha.
plateau would lift it up, and then all this stuff washed off of it, and
Yeah.
it's been continuously washed down, and it's gradually going back in time as it wears the layers down.
Okay,
It's
so
Friday,
a
baby. Friday
disconformity is an
night, yeah.
unconformity. A disconformity
It's the weekend.
is an unconformity. This is from Wikipedia now.
Okay.
Between parallel layers of sedimentary rocks, which represents a period of erosion or non-deposition. Disconformities are marked by features of subaerial erosion. Okay, so subaerial erosion as opposed to submarine erosion. Subaerial means that
In the
it's
air.
in the air. yeah.
Under the air.
Yeah.
Oh
Under
my god,
the air.
what a
yes.
battle this level.
Okay, this type of erosion can leave channels and paleosols in the rock record. Channels because water's been flowing over it, and
Yeah.
paleosols are basically ancient soils.
What is this? Why?
Okay.
Like, what the fuck, man?
Paleosol would be an old and an ancient soil.
So much lag because I didn't pass
In
away the
general,
first guard.
the older layer was exposed to erosion for an interval of time before deposition of the younger layer. But the term is used to describe any break in the sedimentary geological record. The significance of angular unconformity, see below, was shown by James Hutton, who found examples of Hutton's unconformity at Jedburgh in 1787 and at Sticker Point in Berwickshire, both in Scotland. The rocks above an unconformity are younger than the rocks beneath, obviously, unless the sequence has been overturned. Now that's interesting in itself, is how sequences of rocks become overturned. Now obviously we do know, we see there, on our trips to Meteor Crater, there are sequences of rocks that have been overturned. How would you overturn rocks?
Wait, who shot me there? That was just so dumb.
Without an impact.
It'd have to be an earthquake.
Yeah, tectonic activity.
It would have to be tectonic
fuck you.
activity, but doesn't that imply then, if it's slow, I mean, literally, it would have to be compression, not tension. It can't be plates.
Oh my god, man.
It can't be a rift.
Losing
It
my
has to be
mind.
compression.
Well,
Okay.
could be a rift because you could have pieces that fall into it and flip over, and then later that surface is eroded away. I mean, that would be a little more.
Is that possible?
Well, we have seen the ones that, like at the Scablands, their cliff faces drop away and they turn this way as they fall.
Yeah.
They don't flip over completely, but they do.
There's a name for
Yeah.
that.
And we had that. We struggled with that. I found the name. God, it's
don't
right.
know.
It's right here. It's between just under a few layers of skin, right here.
It's in a unconformity in there somewhere.
No, I think it's a disconformity.
Disconformity in okay. All right, well, we can go back to the Holocene. I just wanted to ask those questions. Didn't mean to distract too much.
Well,
from the
yeah,
main
I mean,
topic.
it's okay because, maybe the listeners wouldn't find that as interesting as I do, but I do find that just very interesting. So,
Yeah.
but I do now see there's a whole, okay, good Lord. Okay, so there is a disconformity as well as a nonconformity. And there's also an angular unconformity, and I think that could be along the lines of what Kyle was envisioning. But there's also a paraconformity, and a buttress unconformity, and a blended unconformity.
Blended.
Oh my God.
Blended.
Why? Like,
Gotta
what?
throw a blender in
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
of course.
Oh, a blended unconformity is simply a type of disconformity or nonconformity with no distinct separation plane or contact. Okay. It can sometimes consist of soils, paleosols, right? Ancient soils, or beds of pebbles. Okay. And they've got pictures, and I'll do this on my own, but I'm going to get up to speed on this because, when I came out of historic geology, I was pretty good, on the final exam. We were given 100 fossils that we had to identify. We had to identify the entire stratigraphic column, and I don't remember what all, but I aced it. I could identify all the fossils up to maybe a couple that I missed. I had the whole geological column memorized in my
So
mind,
dumb, man.
all of the most recent dating and everything. Of course, that's changed somewhat too in 30, more than 30. Anyways, yeah, so the Holocene, now we have this date for the beginning of the Holocene, which is such an interesting date that we've talked about many times. What is that date for the bottom of the Holocene?
It's like 11,800 or 11,006.
11.6 to 11.7. I think I've seen it both as 11.6 and 11.7. And we know that the event, there was a climatic event, there was a very rapid warming that occurred, and there was meltwater pulse 1b, which occurred. And it was probably the final stage of the megafaunal extinction. This is something that, again, I think we're just, what species of megafauna? We know some survived the Younger Dryas, but what species and what extent did they survive? We know that mammoths survived the Younger Dryas, but they were in a very isolated condition. They were on islands that forced a reduction in the size of mammoths into pygmy mammoths. The mammoths that survived the Younger Dryas became pygmy mammoths after X number of generations.
Fun, yeah.
And they were
I
like
went wide there.
half the
See how I
size
went wide
of
in the
their
big room? To get
Younger
boosted
Dryas
through the
ancestors.
glass to the console? That's what Goose
So
does.
the question is how
I might do that. I
you know,
just fear
again,
getting
that all
back
of those
boosted.
things are
If you
still
get
being
back
worked
boosted
out,
there,
still being
going wide,
debated.
it's just
You know, the
GG's.
precise chronology and intercorrelation of these different events. Sea level rise.
Yeah,
the
it wasn't
deposition
fast
of the
though.
Younger Dryas proxies, the different
We had the
disappearance of
dumb
the
entry
Clovis
into the
culture,
dark room.
which has came up in
Like,
our
it's just too
last
slow.
live episode because we were talking about those footprints.
If I had a miraculous
down in New
run, it would have been
Mexico
okay.
on Lake
But
Otero, I guess it was called the Playa Lake. That
you
has
could
since
tell by the
desiccated
stopwatch
and
in the pause
there
menu.
was 2,000 years of sedimentary. Remember
So
what
like
we
a
had? Let's
pause
review 7
here at
sedimentary layers
35. What's this?
that had
That's like 30
tracks
right
on
now,
them
right?
spanning
Pause
a
here is
time of
35. It's
2,000
like my PB pace. Anything
And they
lower than
dated
35
that 2,000 years is
is
dated between
PB pace.
21 and 23,000 with some.
But even if I
room for-
have an
for
insane
wiggle.
ending,
Um,
a
so this was
35 pause
definitely
there could be
pre-Holocene.
PB pace.
You're still Pleistocene there, and we talked about how how
The
interesting.
fastest ever I
that
had
is
there
to think
was a
about, to try to
31, 32
reconstruct in our
pause.
minds. Well, what was going on? I mean,
Had that a couple
so there were a
times.
lot of people apparently.
One of
quite
the
a few
9
people.
tragedies.
I mean, walking on the shores of a lake there 22,000 years ago. Where else were the people? Around North America. And so we're late glacial maximum, so we know that if you went up to, think about our trips to Montana and to Washington, we've been right up at the glacier margin where it would have been during the late glacial maximum. Flathead Lake and Polson Moraine. That would have been the southern extent of the Cordilleran ice sheet, which presumably was more or less correlated in time with the Laurentide ice sheet. There's some evidence to suggest there was a lag, so maybe the Cordilleran ice sheet didn't form somewhat like a millennia or two after, didn't reach its maximum extent until somewhat after the Laurentide. But in any case, we're looking at an inhabited, unglaciated North America 22,000 years ago.
Fun, yeah.
More than 10,000 years, or 10,000
It is
years
interesting they're
before
going
the Younger
wide.
Dryas, 10,000 years before the Clovis. So who the hell were these people? And where did they come from?
Yo, Ninja, what's up,
Where
man?
did they go? Was there continuous question in my mind? Was
Did you
there
go on
continuous
vacation
occupation
on?
between
I don't know, man. I think he's
those
just
people and the
chilling.
Clovis, who were also occupying. Remember,
I think
now,
he's
the
just
Clovis were
taking
occupying
some time for
areas
himself.
Very close, right? 'Cause we
I can't
find,
speak for him,
the
but I
Clovis
know he's a
sites
legend. We
in
miss
New
him.
Mexico. However, the
He
Clovis
subbed
people
in my
are there,
channel
what,
the other day,
10,000 years later.
but said he might not. He said he's
So
gonna take
now,
some time
Was
off.
there a continuous
from Twitch.
habitation in there, or did those earlier people then disappear, and there was nobody, and then there was a reoccupation?
We love the guy, man.
I don't know. Does
In
anybody
a
know?
platonic,
I don't know.
non-homosexual way.
I would like to
Not
know
there's anything wrong
what
with being gay.
lithics they're finding associated with those white sands
Mm-hmm.
prints. I
That
mean,
would
because
be-
the
Yeah,
Clovis,
that would be crazy.
we talk about the Clovis people, but that's really a lithic style.
Yeah,
no one-
yeah.
yeah. So it's
No.
Man, that would be awesome if there was. I haven't heard anything about
that's what I'm saying.
their tools.
There's no mention of
I know,
tools.
we
It's
missed
all
the
about
guy.
Footprint. So
There's got to
I'm-
be tools buried in those same
yeah,
sediments. I'm sure somebody dropped a spear
yeah.
in the lake. Somebody
You would
stepped
think.
on it.
You
Yeah.
would think. Well, maybe, just maybe. Now with this kind of, here's the just like what's his our buddy over at on the Savannah River, Dr.
Goodyear.
Goodyear. Like he said when we were out there looking at that
All right, Ninja
that,
Legend, man.
Clovis site out
Nice
there.
podcast today, dude.
Topper.
Stop
thanks,
crying,
Brett. Thanks,
poser.
Brett.
Or
Topper, Dr. Goodyear, Dr. Al
Follow
Goodyear.
Ninja
we were
on
out at the
Twitch,
Topper
Ninja
site with
Lifestyle,
him, and he was basically
YouTube.
telling us that, for years he was just looking at the Clovis, and people would ask him, well, then what's under the Clovis? And he said, well, nothing. He just assumed,
Yeah,
like they
that's
did
Thanks,
across
man.
the board,
There's
that
nowhere
this,
to dig. Yeah.
yeah, so there's no, but when he finally did,
You're
what
making
did he
food
find?
tonight,
He
right?
found, I guess, lithics.
You're making
if I
something
remember
spicy?
right.
Layers of lithics.
Yeah, that went back how far?
Wow, 300. What? That's
Oh,
amazing,
stopper.
dude. That's awesome.
20.
300
I'll
weeks.
I'll
Wow.
look it up.
Yeah.
How
I
many
thought
years
it
is
was
that? That's
20
6
something
years.
thousand, 20. I'll look it up.
Well, see, then that
I
would
would say
correlate.
26, but yeah, that's a guess. It's 20
That
plus.
kind of
for sure.
puts
Frozen
it then
burrito's
in the
nice.
same time frame as
I stay home, not sure
the
yet.
Lake Otero.
Did you add hot sauce in?
They were at the end of the age of Aquarius.
I thought this was the
You
dawning.
can make
of the
anything
Aquarius.
great with
Well, I
hot
guess they would
sauce.
have been.
Oh, you're saying that would have been the.
Tapatio.
Well, yeah, you're right. You're right. So,
like it
uh,
would have been
Lo
maybe
siento.
Capricorn.
The website Wikipedia
Yeah,
says
50,000.
Whoa.
Wilson.
50,000.
well, it says
Okay.
the primary dig has gone to
Wait,
a
who
ground
shot
of
me?
50,000, but
Come on, man.
artifacts may predate Clovis by 3,000 years or more, but conclusions are disputed.
Yeah.
Right.
So Goodyear argues that the deepest layer has carbonized plant remains, which he argues is a fire pit. Dated at
Tapatio.
50,000 years old.
Okay. So the difference here then is the, the evidence itself. So
300, buddy.
the evidence
Congratulations.
at Topper is
That's amazing.
being disputed, and you can argue it both ways, I guess. You know, because 50,000, I'm inclined to believe that there were people 50,000, but that's not quite the same in terms of confirmation for the existence of people as footprint.
Right.
It's
And,
pretty
you know,
obvious.
depending on the lithics,
We're not going to play this level forever, my
It can get
friends. We're
pretty
not.
sketchy too. I mean, like
It
promise.
can, yeah. And when
there's
you're,
these people are
We're
arguing
going to do other
whether
levels.
these flint
What we need this time.
chunks could have been broken in certain ways
Why?
by grinding when they're really primitive points.
yeah,
Kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, they start calling them geofacts.
Yeah,
Instead of
geofacts.
artifacts. They're like, oh, well, a glacier could slide along just so and break the flint where it kind of looks like a unifacial.
The thing that really doesn't make sense though is when they're concentrated in like a little area, like a campsite.
Yeah.
It's
yes,
next to a creek.
Double
Yeah,
duck.
come on.
right. Where they're doing their
Fucking
napping
sucks,
and
man.
their
Yeah.
flinting and all of that, you're going to find the debitage there
Yes.
concentrated. Now,
Yes.
if you can find that correlated perhaps with what looks like a fire pit or some kind of
Yeah,
habitation,
burnt
yeah,
rocks.
that's right. So, like Russ, you were saying earlier, I mean, the farther back you go, the sketchier.
Oh, I
the
don't have my input display. Guys, you got to let me
What we
know. You
need
got to
is-
tell me. You gotta tell me.
we need human remains. But
Right.
that's the thing
Where
we
are
talked
these
about
people?
last week. Where the hell are the people? We've got thousands and thousands of woolly mammoths and megafaunal animals that have been found in various states. Just like Kyle was saying, you would expect that just like somebody dropping a spear, somebody's going to die and fall in a crevice and get
Yeah.
frozen in, and we're going to find something, or they're going to get caught in a flood,
Right.
flash flood. But where is the human remains? Like, where are the Clovis remains? So we see their campsites all over the damn continent, unglaciated North America. But where are their remains?
Yeah, I wonder if this is part of the argument for there being just very few people. You know, there were millions of mammoths, there weren't that many humans, and that's why their remains have not been found.
What
And
is
yet,
that?
and
don't
yet the
know.
humans killed them all.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, right. Exactly. What does
humans
that
killed
say
all the
about the
mammoths.
overkill?
Yeah.
If that's the case.
Speaking of mammoths, how did they get out to Catalina Island? I know this is kind of going. This is a tangent, but how the hell?
I guess you were doing Ninja
they get
Cast
out there?
before and Shredcast prior.
I mean, is this a valid question? Did they swim?
Fur floats.
Well, elephants can swim.
That's
they
pretty
can
far.
swim.
Yeah, that's
But-
pretty far though. In the water, I mean, I looked it up. The water gets like half a mile deep, so there's no chance there was a walkway
Right.
with a 400-foot drop in sea levels. I mean, it's seems kind of far to swim, but maybe. But you know, enough of them swam out there to where you have a population that can get small.
They were shipped out there.
I was
Yeah,
telling,
I know, that's what I'm saying.
They were
Well, you
imported.
know, I remember
it was-
after the Atlantis presentation, and I was presenting the argument. that
Maybe Toad's
geologically,
here right now. Not they
Atlantis isn't
should
so
break alert.
far-fetched. You know, that was the,
But
I think the takeaway of that, it looks like we have a subsided
he's just given
landmass
so
in the
much
middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it dated
of
to
his
the
time,
appropriate time when it would have been above sea level,
his
and
money,
it would have been a very benign climate.
of his
So,
attention.
then the question is, how did people get there? Well, obviously they had navigational skills, because we know that there were islands inhabited by people going back 50,000 years ago. So people were beginning to develop the seafaring skills really long time ago, right? But then, as Plato says, there were a lot of elephants in Atlantis. So then somebody, I remember, posted a comment and said, well, that
Must have been mammoths.
well, elephant, mate. Well, it's like, well, okay. Well, the argument was, I think this came up in the controversy with the recat structure.
Okay.
Because the recat structure could have had elephants, but the argument was these elephants couldn't swim out to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Right? And I pretty much, I agree with that, but we're talking about a major maritime culture here with
Yeah, you got a big
navigational
enough
skill and
ship.
ships.
Yeah.
They bring some mating pairs of elephants. That's,
That's all you need.
that's all you need.
Yeah.
And, if you're, they were doing this
elephants.
tremendous, the infrastructure that he
God.
describes, whether that's literally true or an accurate, I think it's very possible that they were conducting massive engineering project,
Yeah.
which we know early man did, because the evidence of that is everywhere.
Yeah.
So, and if they were doing that, perhaps
I don't know why I reloaded,
elephants
that
might
was
have
dumb.
been handy in moving 10
Yeah,
tons.
beasts of burden.
Beasts of burden.
But so are you telling me that somebody put mammoths on
Runs
a ship
are
and
not
bring them
going
out to
well.
Catalina Island? Is that what you're saying?
Hey, Neanderthals were apparently sailing around 100,000
Yeah,
years ago.
100,000 years ago. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, maybe. What if you would just decide to ride it out there? If you can ride it, then you just get on it. You tell it, "Let's go out into the water."
okay,
Yes.
well, let me ask you
Why?
this. Is there any evidence that Catalina Island was inhabited?
Yeah, there's burial sites there, and some of them are very interesting. I don't know if they're considered to be contemporary with the mammoths, but yeah.
Well, so that if they're contemporary with the mammoths, then I'd say that.
I was saying I don't think they're considered to be contemporary with
Oh,
the mammoths.
okay.
I don't know. I don't remember, but we did go over some Catalina Island burials that are very
So they're
interesting.
not Clovis then. Anyway.
I don't know.
Okay.
I
would
think
have to
so.
check. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see the.
It's also winter
yeah,
here.
the
It
Channel
sucks.
Island, Santa Rosa. Now,
People become very depressed in the winter.
megafaunal remains have been found on Santa Rosa Island, along
Like
with
really depressed.
human. I think they found a
That's why I'm playing
skeleton
so much Goldeneye.
of a girl there. Is that?
I'm imagining I'm in
right?
Teotihuacan, Mexico.
Now, I'm not seeing the bathymetry here. I don't have Google Earth open, but
You have to.
Santa Rosa in the Channel,
Otherwise you lose your
Channel
mind.
Islands National Park. Now that was inhabited.
Channel
Yeah.
Islands. That's the.
Seems like you guys had checked in something that there was like evidence of elephants swimming a mile out to islands off of India or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know how far. Catalina's farther than that for sure, but yeah, Santa Rosa might have been fairly close with the sea level difference.
8 complete human skeletons, 250 skulls.
So much lag. We're
9,500
gonna head a visit or
feet, and
two
fragments of bones numbering
or
almost
two.
3,000 persons now
I don't think it
repose
lured
in
him
the
though. I have no
Living
health.
Catalina
It's
Indian
fast though. You
Museum,
see my pause like a 33 there?
with many other articles of historic importance.
Well, that's where all the clothes went. There you go.
And so I'm looking here. It looks like Catalina Island is about 30 miles off the.
That's pretty far.
Yeah. Of course, now it wouldn't have been that far with sea level down, but you're
Right.
saying that the depth of the ocean between Catalina and the west coast of California, there south of Los Angeles, gets a mile deep, is what you said.
3,000 feet is the deepest.
Yeah,
Oh.
there's a huge submarine canyon out there.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's something in
I just might have to open Google.
But you know,
Chrome.
I was trying to just look up like how deep does it get, but then it occurred to me that maybe there's a part that gets that deep, and there could be a shallow area that you could have walked on. I don't know. I'd have to look at the. Anyway, it was just an aside question. You know, how did they get out there?
That's
Well,
It's a really
yeah,
interesting
yeah,
strat.
yeah.
Just gotta make sure you get shot
45 minutes
and
in.
not back boosted.
Oh yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
see
try doing
this.
that.
And
This is
look at this.
important research, guys.
Well, I mean, these are interesting questions.
It's been interesting. I agree.
There is a very deep channel. Wow, minus 11,000 feet.
Whoa.
But it would be relatively narrow, though. So with sea level down, if we could do this just for laughs here, I will we'll do a share screen. And so here I've got Google Earth Pro open, and let's see, Catalina. Back up here.
That's directly out from like Laguna Beach there, south of LA.
Yeah. Wow, that's some pretty wild seafloor topography
Yeah,
there.
it's wild looking. Yeah, mountainous.
Yeah, look at that. Wow. So let's see. I believe this is Catalina here, or is it? No, it's
Yeah, I
this.
think it's that one. Yeah.
That's that one. Right.
Okay, that's a big deep channel right there.
So that right there is 2,850, 29. So yeah, almost 3,000 feet down here.
So how wide is it from the edge of the shelf there to the island? Assuming that's
Like-
what they
it's
had
like
to swim.
halfway out.
Yeah, so 15 miles maybe.
Let's see, miles. Could do this.
Wow.
That's about 24 miles across there.
Oh, that's a
So that'd
swim.
been quite a swim.
Yeah.
Now, you're assuming that this was all that this was a canyon back then. If you look at that, it may have been eroded out. If you look at the topography
By water
Well-
coming from up north
there. Yeah.
Or
Well,
or
they've all
like
been
tides or
tectonic
something.
changes.
Yeah, may have been all been carved out. You've also got a short distance here. But this may have been above water here.
We can't see where you're pointing, Mike.
Oh yeah, sorry. Go to the north.
go north. You can see
north.
my cursor, right?
Yep.
Okay. I'm all the way up.
Pull the map down.
Okay.
Over here to the left.
Oh, I see. Yeah, there's a
There's
What is that, like a
if
sea
this
mount?
if this was above water, there's a short jaunt across there.
Okay, so right here where I'm hovering over this prominence here, it's minus 2,300, and then when I go here,
that's still
we're,
pretty deep.
Yeah.
we're minus 20, almost 26. And so there's about a 300-foot difference here. But all of it would have been underwater. But yeah, I mean, obviously, well, look at this.
Yeah, that's
Look at that.
That's what I was talking about, erosion. Man, look, you got
that's like
looks you have
water
massive
poured
erosion.
off the edge there. and
Well,
into the-
yeah, it sure does. Look at this.
Yeah.
All right, so now, okay, you guys, now once you get certified, here's your first assignment.
3,000
Hey,
feet.
you want us to dive there? Yeah. 3,000 feet, no problem, bro.
Go and check this out. We need to know.
Randall, our
yeah.
open water course certifies us to 60 feet.
Yeah, and there'll be 60-foot waves on top of that.
Oh.
I don't know.
Okay, it just more and more, it just seems like we're gonna have to
Get
bite the
underwater.
bullet and get a submersible,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
but not one that's made out of carbon fiber. Okay.
Right. But I can control it with a Logitech
Yes.
game controller.
Because you
as
are.
long as it's made out of the right material.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look at this. My God. So look, it even looks like we've got like eroded recessional cataracts, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Look at that.
Yeah.
So is that? I mean, it does look like we've major pouring off right here. What? Okay, so now if we go up, well, look. So here you've got. Is this channel embankments here?
Yeah, I can't tell.
You got water pouring off. You got, this is, okay, that's 83 feet above sea level. And then you get right into the mountains here. We're, you know, that's 1,500 feet. Over here we got 600 feet. So say 500. So you could have a channel here that's 500 feet deep. And let me grab the ruler here. Miles, okay. Well, so about 6 miles wide there. But we also look like we could have something coming up this way.
What's that big right angle there? That's got to be some kind of artifact. That's very unnatural.
Which?
Oh yeah, out there
Directly
off the
left,
coastline.
Off the coast, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, this?
yeah.
Yeah.
That just looks like
Those look like scanning artifacts to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, it's got to be. Oh, it went away, yeah.
Yep, there's
Yeah, so
detailed
you have
scans.
a high resolution scan that's in a big rectangle there.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So Brad, for a moment there, thought he had discovered an underwater civilization off the coast.
I
He had
just
this
said that
moment
was an
of elation
artifact. Not a literal artifact, but an artifact of the bathymetry data. Yeah.
All right. Well, these have been interesting questions. We don't have any answers, so maybe we should move back to the Holocene again.
Where there
Okay.
are also no answers.
There are also no answers and still more questions.
Well, we might as well
We can take a break.
cruise around before
if
the
it's
break
break
here.
time.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's about break time.
Okay,
And
I'm
no
gonna
shortage of fascinating stuff to look off the coast.
Really? Yeah, so then, all right, well, yeah, let me just, I guess I'll go hit the restroom for a second and then we can continue. I mean, I've got some good stuff pulled up here.
Okay. Cool. Well, we will take a short break and be right back.
All right.
All right, we're back, ladies and gentlemen. Back on track. We're not going past the Holocene, right?
Yeah, we're going to we're going to pretty much try to summarize 11,600 years in 45 minutes. So, this is
Okay.
the challenge that awaits us.
Holy recent.
Spoken like a true geologist.
So, we've all heard about the Bronze Age collapse, right? Well, yeah, something else we're learning more about every month. But this came out in 30 some years ago. Actually, about 30 years, because 1993. What was interesting about that early 90s is that's when we really began to get some high resolution records of, like, you know, Holocene, not only Holocene climate change, but climate change going back, you know, tens of thousands of years. Because, you know, it was 92 and 93 when those ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica had been extracted and analyzed, and it became apparent that all of the other more indeterminate evidence that suggested extremely rapid climate changes is now showing up with a great deal of clarity in the ice cores. Now, I don't know, let's see, this is not necessarily based on ice cores, but this is definitely Holocene, talking about Mesopotamia, the North Mesopotamian civilization, and which would have been 3rd millennium BC, and those civilizations there were irrigation based. So they had built this whole vast infrastructure of canals and aqueducts and things so that they could irrigate their civilization. And so in this paper that came out in 93, it's entitled The Genesis and Collapse of 3rd Millennium North Mesopotamian Civilization. So archaeological and soil stratigraphic data define the origin, growth, and collapse of Sumer or Subarta the third millennium rain-fed agricultural civilization of northern Mesopotamia on the Habur plains of Syria. At 2200 BC, there was a marked increase in the atmospheric circulation patterns and in the rainfall patterns. And this followed on the heels of a very large volcanic eruption. So what's the connection? I don't know. But these events are temporally correlated. The change in atmospheric and wind circulation, the rapid change in the onset of aridity from being relatively a moist climate, it became very arid very quickly. So after 4 centuries of urban life, this abrupt climate change evidently caused abandonment of Tel Lelan,
Why?
regional desertion, and collapse of the Akkadian
So
Empire
dumb, man.
that was based in southern Mesopotamia. So synchronous collapse in adjacent regions suggests that the impact of the abrupt climate change was extensive. So what was the nature of this climate change now that, so this is around 2200 BC. So I think this falls right in that window of Bronze Age collapse. Am I right? What's the dating on the Bronze Age, Kyle?
It's pretty spread out last time I looked at it. I think it's
Like 32 to 43, somewhere in that range.
So this would have been post-Bronze Age.
Yeah, 3300 BC to 1200 BC.
That's right in the middle of it.
So this is right in the middle. Okay.
BC, yeah. Okay.
So they're in this paper. They're addressing two understood questions that first attracted attention 50 years ago. The first is the problem of secondary state formation, or
This is so
when,
fast.
how, and why
Oh, it
the
was like so
pre-state
fast.
societies
It's like
of these
22
regions,
pause.
adjacent to
23.
pristine civilizations, were transformed into state-level societies. Well, I think one implication there is for that to occur, you have to essentially have one of those episodes of relatively stable climate. Because if you have agricultural collapse, if you have onset of an extensive drought, I mean, that's what pulls the plug on these civilizations, or one of the things, one of the factors that could contribute in a major way. The developmental history of Sumer's northern neighbor, Subartu, they had rain-fed cereal agriculture in northern Syria. The second problem, okay, so basically here's the problem. The first problem they're asking is, how did these civilizations arise and come about in the first place? And then the second problem is state collapse, or when, how, and why stable or expanding early civilizations suddenly disintegrate. And after a period of instability, were eventually replaced by new state organization, often controlled by new economic groups. The sudden collapse of the Akkadian Empire at 2200 BC is the earliest historical example of this problem. Now that was in 93. So the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, and obviously to me it sounds like it's brought about by external circumstances more so. Now there may have been internal, let's say there's conflict or competition for resources that wasn't there previously. So yes, there could be degeneration in the social conditions stemming directly from the degeneration in natural climatic or environmental conditions. I think perhaps the limiting framework of thinking about these things in the past is that it was exclusively due to internecine or internal affairs that were going on, and that if you were considering in the larger context of environmental or climatic change, then they often were dismissively referring to that as determinism, as climate determinism. And climate determinism was considered for a long time, pretty much to be an outlying model of prehistory, but not so much anymore, because now the evidence
Nice,
is
dude.
pretty much overwhelming that these changes,
Never
these
forget how
external
important you
changes in
are.
the climate and the environment have affected
The rarest Pepe is you.
civilizations to a much greater extent than was recognized 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So in this article, and this was published in Science, 20th of August 1993, if anybody wants to look it up and read in more detail about it, because it goes on with some really interesting
Thanks for
stuff.
reading, man.
But it's Tel Lelan, one of 3 large third millennium cities on the
Why?
Haber Plain,
What?
which I could pull up on the map, but I don't think I will. This particular site occupied 70 to 100 hectares at maximum size, and was dominated by a 15-hectare acropolis that today rises 20 meters above the level of the plain. It was occupied from the mid-6th century millennium BC. Tel Lelan became a major center in the mid-3rd millennium BC and the political capital of the region in the early 2nd millennium BC. So then they describe their excavations there and what they found. Let me see if I can find any good pictures of remains. Not too much, really. But yeah, so there was an abrupt climatic change that brought the whole thing to a sudden end. So it was clearly a catastrophic event. Now, whether it happened over a matter of weeks or,
time.
you know, I mean, really, you could think of it, if it happened over a generation, that's catastrophic. Anything that happens within the framework of the human time span, certainly I think would qualify as being catastrophic. But yeah, it goes on. There's a very interesting stuff. So, final in the concluding comments here, it says that the abrupt climate change that generated the Haber hiatus 1 and the associated Akkadian Ur 3 collapse are synchronous with climate change and collapse phenomena documented in the Aegean, Egypt, Palestine,
Please.
and the Indus.
Why?
So this was a major event in the second third of the Holocene. So that would be, in my mind, worthy of more attention to learn more about that, because it looks like whatever it was that was behind all this caused pretty much the collapse of everything that was going on around the Mediterranean. That pretty much encompasses all of the acknowledged advanced state societies, cultures, civilizations that would have been happening around the Mediterranean, and it looks like they all pretty much collapsed within the same narrow window. So, raises some interesting questions. What happened, in 2200 BC, and how much more extensive? Was it only limited to events around the Mediterranean, or was it more widespread? Did it cover a whole continent or a hemisphere, or possibly was it even global in extent?
When the starting date, he said 5300 or 3300 BC, right? So you're getting back to potential dates for the Burkle impact, which, some of those ripples we've looked at, the direction of that tsunami, could have affected the Mediterranean, and then, Bronze Age was started up after that catastrophe.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. Now, here's another paper. This is a little bit more recent.
What dates did you get? Sorry, what dates did you get for the Bronze Age collapse? Because I'm seeing much more recent.
3300 to 1200 BC, I think it was.
So yeah, 3,200 years ago. What was familiar to me?
Well, what we were just looking at was 4,000 years ago.
This is the Bronze Age collapse, also known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, between 1200 and 1150. It was during the 12th century BC.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's 1,000 years later than what we were just talking about.
Okay. Now,
what does that suggest? So here is the 9th century before Common Era destruction layer at Tel Es Safi /Gath, Gath, Israel, integrating macro and microarchaeology, and that is from 2011. This appeared in the Journal of Archaeological Science, volume 38, 2011. And this is what it opens with in the abstract. Destruction events in multi-period sites are valuable marker horizons that represent time synchronous events across the site and sometimes between sites. Now that's exactly what we were discussing in our opening conversation that we're having, wasn't it? The idea that these events can leave markers that can be correlated over much larger distance. That's what it says here, the term time synchronous events across the site and sometimes between sites. Okay, so then it goes on to say that destruction layers often preserve rich finds that provide insights into site use. Here we use both macro and micro archaeological methods to study a destruction event from the late 9th century at Tel Es Gath in Israel. Now get this, a major conflagration at this specific location resulted in the consolidation of parts of the roof construction materials, thus enabling us to differentiate between roof, walls, and floor materials. So that was, we touched briefly on that on the live episode. So that was, we have a major destruction event involving conflagration, happened in Israel, and this was 9th century BC, or basically 2,000 years ago. Now again, how was this just a local event or a regional event or beyond? But it says here we examine the case of a seemingly short-term violent event. The destruction of Tel Es Safi Gath, Israel, dated to the mid-late 9th century before Common Era.
Yeah, I think we discussed this before, and we were looking at pictures that they have in the paper. Yeah.
So I just basically wanted to revisit that to get the date of that.
Okay.
So this was 9th century. So this is like basically
almost 3,000 years ago, right?
9th century BC would be almost 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. Almost 3,000. And then the other one, the earlier destruction there in Mesopotamia we were looking at was about 1,200 years then before that.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I'm curious, what else happened 9th century before Common Era? Now, if you could find other destruction layers that correlated with that, now, of course, you can begin to reconstruct the extent.
Oh, come on. That was so good.
Let's see. Then there's, when is this from here? This is another report from 1995. The destruction of Megiddo at the end of the late Bronze Age. Renewed excavations at Tel Megiddo planned on a long-term systematic basis in order to study the stratigraphy of the site and the material culture. Okay, so this was done under Tel Aviv University. And I haven't read this article yet, other than it gets into that there was a destruction event there that occurred at Stratum 7, and I'm trying to see quickly what the date of this was. I'm not seeing it right away, so let's see. This other one was, I found very interesting, was but yeah, so we'll add that to the list. I'm going to do some additional research here so we can report on this, because this is ongoing. This is from the year 2000. Poseidon's horses, plate tectonics, and earthquake storms in the late Bronze Age Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. In light of the accumulated evidence now published, the oft denigrated suggestion that major earthquakes took place in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean areas during the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC must be reconsidered. Okay, well, now that brings us right back to 3,200 years ago, right in there, in that window. A new study of earthquakes occurring in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean region during the 20th century, utilizing data recorded since the invention of seismic tracking devices, shows that this area is crisscrossed with major fault lines, and that numerous temblors of magnitude 6.5 or above, which are enough to destroy modern buildings, let alone those of antiquity, occur frequently. It can be demonstrated that such major earthquakes often occur in groups known as sequences or storms, in which one large
54
quake is
pass
followed
away
days,
is pretty
months,
fast.
and
That's
even
PB.
years later by
PB pace.
others elsewhere on the now weakened fault line. So, when a map of the areas
We're close,
in the
man.
Aegean
We're really
Eastern
close.
Mediterranean region,
The only thing we're missing now is
that is
persistence.
shaken by 20th century
That's what we
AD
need right now.
earthquakes of magnitude 6.5
And a good sense of
and
humor.
greater, when that is overlaid on the map of sites destroyed in these same regions during the so-called catastrophe near the end of the late Bronze Age, it is readily apparent that virtually all of these
Honestly,
late
if I
Bronze
didn't play
Age
these
sites
podcasts,
lie
I would
within
go crazy.
the
Not because
affected areas or
because
high shaking areas.
with these podcasts, I feel like I at least learned something.
The evidence would suggest that an earthquake storm may have occurred in the late Bronze Age. Late Bronze Age Aegean
You know what I
and
mean?
Eastern Mediterranean during the years 1225 to 1175 BC. This storm may have interacted with
It's all
other
good, you can lurk,
forces
no
at
worries.
work in these areas.
Lurking is
Circa
allowed.
1200 BC, and merits consideration by archaeologists and prehistorians. So this is 23 years ago when this came out. In the introduction, they
Could have been faster though.
point out that scholars have long noted
why I
a
wasn't
series of
too
destructions
Worried about it.
datable
It was
between
slower than I thought
1225
it'd be
and
though.
1175 BC, which are usually attributed to human actions, like we were talking about before, right? That that these destructions were, pretty much exclusively the social problems or competition
Whereas
for
PB pace.
resources leading to warfare and so forth.
Yeah.
What was ignored was the idea that they may have had a trigger that was outside of society, outside of culture. So he's now the authors of this. Let's see. Yeah, the two authors are with the Department of Geophysics and the Department of Classics. Okay, so these guys have teamed up. So one guy is a geophysicist, and the other guy is a doctor of classical literature. So that's the kind of interesting cross disciplinary science that can be so interesting. So they're referring to the work which I haven't followed up on, but a Claude Schaefer, who first made a suggestion that an earthquake might be responsible for those destructions in 1948. And then he wrote another paper in 1968, and it says that this was not well received by his peers, in part because these catastrophic events at the end of the Bronze Age were spread over a 50-year period and could not have been the result of a single geological event. And I think, this is kind of what we've seen even with the idea of the dismissal of an impact hypothesis for the mass extinction. Because some paleontologists have come forward and said, well, the mass extinction didn't all happen in one instant, one temporal instant where they all went dead, where they were all killed off globally, and therefore there were no cosmic impact. I mean, that has been oversimplified, but that's been pretty much the essence of some of the attempts to negate or refute or dismiss the idea that cosmic impacts may have played the key role in the megafaunal extinctions, is because, well, we can show that the megafaunal extinctions happened over, a number of decades or centuries or, within that range, or even a millennia or two, and therefore it was not attributable to cosmic impact. That has been the argument. Now, but the problem with that is just like we see here. If you have this oversimplified that there's one earthquake, it's not preceded by foreshocks or not followed by aftershocks that could extend over decades.
Come on, man.
Even.
Like, shoot the guys.
So that by the time you have a society that, suffers one destruction, maybe not a complete destruction, but enough of a destruction that that there's obviously going to be recovery time. But before you can get fully recovered, you've got another destructive event, and you have a succession of these over a period of a generation or two. It may be enough, probably would be enough, to pretty much pull the plug on whatever was going on, right? Just makes sense. So it sort of the argument kind of got into these oversimplified terms. So the gradualists weren't ready to acknowledge the possibility of catastrophism, because basically they had this straw man image of what a catastrophic model would entail, which would be just one big event and boom, that's it, right? But if this is possible, that you've got what they're talking about here, earthquake storms, just as possible as you might have impact swarms, that there may be a period of intensified impact activity that could last several centuries, right? Now, and then of course that raises the question, what is the connection, if any, between impact events and seismic events? Well, we have one precedent that we can look at. The Tunguska event, which was an aerial burst, was able to trigger a greater than 5, like a 5.5 on the Richter scale earthquake. So what could actual series of events do, of impact events? Is it so outlandish to consider that there could be a correlation between impact swarms and earthquake swarms? I don't know. What do you think, Russ? While I catch my breath.
All right. No, I think that makes sense. I mean, like you said, if Tunguska can make a 5.0 on the Richter scale earthquake, then
yeah,
multiple explosions in the atmosphere, some things impacting, and that happening over a period of years it would trigger earthquakes, volcanoes, who knows?
Well, who knows, right?
And then all of that would contribute to changing climate, aside from the immediate catastrophic effects.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting paper. So
I did find that the Indus Valley collapsed, but not at 900, but at like 13 to 1200 BC.
Come on, man.
So that's more in line with the Bronze Age collapse.
Aha. So this article, which was, when did I say it was published? In the Journal of Archaeological Science in the year 2000. The present article surveys the available geophysical and archaeological evidence and suggests that this 50-year period of destruction in antiquity could have been the result of a series of related earthquakes known as an earthquake storm. And then the authors point out that it may have interacted with other forces at work in these areas circa 1200 BC. So the geophysical evidence, all earthquakes of maximum intensity of 7 and larger, which occurred between 1900 and 1980 in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, have been recorded by modern seismic instruments and are depicted graphically. The epicenters are easily calculated. The intensity and maximum ground motion felt at a particular location is also easily calculated. Since intensity is a simple function of magnitude and distance from the epicenter and is measured on the so-called modified Mercalli scale. So then they chart all of these earthquakes, and there's been a bunch of them, wow, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, up into Turkey, over into, Syria, Lebanon, but I think there are pictures here. And yeah, the archaeological evidence gets really interesting. So the archaeological evidence, let me jump here. What they found was, they found that the buildings had collapsed. They found skeletons under the rubble of the house room north of the citadel. And this is just an example of which there are many. In a house built 200 meters north of the citadel, on the lower slope of Prophetess Ilias at Placus, a building which was destroyed in the circa 1250 BC. The basements were found full of fallen stones, which covered the skeletons of 3 adults and a child crushed beneath them. In addition, the walls of several rooms were found fallen down the slope. Other walls were found leaning outwards, including one basement wall, which had tilted so much the gap was left where it had originally joined with another wall, and huge chunks of plaster, both painted and unpainted, had come loose from the walls and crashed onto the floors. House number 1 of the Panagia group, built on the west slope of the ridge north of the treasury of Atreus, destroyed violently. And quoting, the skeleton of a middle-aged woman whose skull was crushed by a falling stone was found in the doorway between the main room and the anteroom. The body was then buried by the debris of the house, which included smashed vessels and a chimney pot lying on the floor. Furthermore, the excavators noted, quote, the collapsed state of the doorway leading into the house and the condition of the south wall of room 2, where the preserved portion of that wall was found leaning outward towards the south. And it goes on and on. House 1 was suddenly destroyed. The pile of stones found all over its area, the smashed vases with all their pieces in place under stones, the lack of burned remains, the discovery of a female skeleton in the doorway of its main room with skull broken by fallen stones all seem to indicate that House 1 was destroyed by a violent earthquake. So, yeah, it goes on, and here we go. Let's see, I'll do a share screen here. Let me find some of these interesting photographs here. Oh, yeah. So here's one of the skeletons that got...
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wait,
The skeleton, let's see, skeleton in the background. Let's see. A, that's A. So let's go up here. Oh, yeah, look at the skeleton is here. Is that the same skeleton? Looks like it, yeah. Yeah, that poor fella met an untimely end, didn't he?
Yeah, if that was the one in the doorway, it was a woman, I guess.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's see here. Tilted eastern. Okay, here we go. There's your tilted eastern and western walls within building 6. So some of the walls didn't get knocked all the way down, but they're tilted. And then apparently there has been not enough seismic activity since then to finish the job of knocking these walls down. So this goes on the basis, on many sites actually they're looking at here. The idea of an earthquake having contributed to the destruction of Troy circa 1250 BC is a matter of some controversy. However, with scholars suggesting that some of the observed damage could have been caused by subsidence and settling rather than solely due to an earthquake. On the other hand, the final report by the excavators stated that, quote, we feel confident in attributing the disaster to a severe earthquake. They believe that a violent earthquake shock will account more convincingly than any probable human agency for the toppling of the great city wall. A later re-examination by Rapp in 1982, a geoarchaeologist, further concluded that on the basis of the large quantity of loose material and the abundance of trimmed blocks in the debris from the major destruction of Troy, I believe that the most tenable hypothesis for the cause of this destruction lies in foundation failures stemming from earthquake-induced earth movements in the underlying unconsolidated material. Interpreted thus, the evidence applied by the excavators seems overwhelming. So all of these things now, and there's a lot more, have to do with the Holocene and what's been going on in the Holocene. And I think what we're finding out is that the Holocene is a lot more interesting and dynamic, particularly now when we start looking the two parallel strands here. On the one, the history of civilization, of, the emergence of culture and society and the development of infrastructure and advanced societies, and what's going on in the natural environment. And I think we're now at that phase where we're really beginning to see the correlations there, and realizing that
What's up, Daltona?
determinism
Dalton
is, in
A600,
fact, the
what's
more
up?
accurate way to, and in fact, the only way that
Going
we're
pretty
gonna
well. Thanks,
understand
man.
these events throughout the Holocene.
Going really well, actually.
And I think that maybe
Any
part
run.
of the reason there's this reluctance is because if we begin to recognize that there
Could
have been
be
a succession
any run
of,
now.
well, we'll say dynamic events or even catastrophic events throughout the Holocene, what does that imply for models of climate change that are based on the assumptions of pre-industrial prolonged stability? Well, it brings all that into
I
serious
have
question.
9
So I
runs
think
where
that
it
very
passed
possibly
away
there's
in
a
the big room
disincentive to
at the
really
end,
to look at this and to acknowledge
which
how
is really
dynamic the
encouraging.
Holocene has been. And there is a whole bunch of stuff that
'Cause one of them has
that
one
now
of
is
them,
at
one
the
has
end
got to
that
complete
you
one,
think
just one.
contradicts. You guys were aware of the fact that that we just that was just the COP28, I believe it was, held in Dubai.
Yes.
Some of the stuff that's coming out of there, CNN is reporting on it. So yeah,
Hope you're doing well.
CNN, here's quoting CNN: "It's time to limit how often we can travel abroad." So they're pushing now for carbon passport.
I did see that.
Yeah. Drastic changes to our travel habits are inevitable. Suggests restrictions will be forced upon the public. So are you guys ready to sign up for your carbon passport, which tracks how much carbon you use in your movements around? I mean, that's literally what it does.
Does it track how many trees
Oh,
I
it's brutal.
plant, man?
That's so terrible.
Oh, man. Yeah, so they are saying that not again, this may be our last chance. COP28 talks enter the final phase. This is it, our last chance. And there were 475 lobbyists attending the COP28, most of whom arrived in private jets.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody calculated their carbon footprint, and it's gigantic. So my point in deviating into that is that to recognize that there are natural forces at work here, that there have been extreme droughts, extreme floods, changes in temperature, all of this kind of stuff happening naturally, irrelevant to what we're doing, and we're the victims of these changes.
The ice jug
rather than
ASMR, the
perpetrators,
gallon
because
water
the
ASMR.
The whole scenario has been flip-flopped 180 degrees. So now, rather than what history is showing us, what the data is showing us is that we, the human species, and our handiwork on the planet have been affected by these events. Are we going to,
Thank you,
somebody
Dalton.
gonna argue that
That's
an
really
earthquake
nice of you.
swarm at,
You are the man for saying
1200
that, dude.
BC
Thank you, man.
is the result of
That's really kind of you, my man.
humans' activity? Probably not.
That's
You're
really
probably not
kind of you,
going to
dude.
convince anybody of that.
But you know what?
But
We all
the
have
point
a story.
is that this is a natural thing. Now,
Everyone has like a
is that
struggle,
correlated with other stuff, changes in the climate?
and sharing
You know, we saw the
our
one that was preceded there, the one
perseverance through the struggle
3,200 years, 4,200
is
years
what
ago.
makes our
The first
story
one I looked at
interesting.
was preceded by a
for
volcanic
others and
eruption.
inspiring
Now,
for
didn't
others.
go into detail on the location or magnitude
So
of
it's
that
like
volcanic
everyone-
eruption. But there again, can
I
we
pray
see
that's
that
the hardest thing I go
would it
through in
not
my
make
life. It might
sense
not
that
be,
if
you know, there might be harder
impacts
things,
are
there
triggering
might be
seismic
sadder
activity,
things.
that seismic activity could also be correlated with volcanic activity? I think we'd be idiots if we just categorically rejected that possibility. So, you know, if there are, and that's the thing I think that we have to really be moving towards this
Thanks, bro.
integrated model.
Yeah, it's
That
been a
everything
hard
can be
one,
affecting everything else.
but
And up to this point,
still
I think what the Holocene has
deaf in
shown us
my left
is
ear.
that these natural
I
changes
still
have
can't hear out of my
affected
left
humans
ear,
far more than the
and it's a
inverse
loud
of that.
ringing noise.
But now we're trying to be, you know, be
All the time.
propagandized into believing that it's all up to our activity. And so now we've got to be issued
But it is what it
carbon
is.
passports.
It could be
I mean,
worse.
that's what
It could
they're-
be way
I mean,
worse.
That's what they're talking about. They're talking about, you know, eventually by the 2030s,
It could be like
they're going to be
way worse.
monitoring all of our carbon use.
If you do what the
Pretty
elites
miraculous. That's
say,
not
everything will be
worse.
fine.
Right. We will own nothing and like it
Yeah.
and be happy. That's what it is, right?
The other interesting thing that you can draw from
Pretty
things like the Bronze
miraculous
Age
the
collapse
strength
being
of the
caused
human
by
body.
external
and
factors
the human
like climate
spirit.
or earthquakes, you know, in other words, catastrophic events.
Yeah.
I'm just happy it
is
happened when I
you
was
have
young,
What amounts
at the
to
age of 30.
basically a regional catastrophe, probably. It
because
wasn't-
that was really
I'm
important
not sure
for
if it
the
was
ability to
considered be global,
regrow my
this thing that
nerves
caused the
and
Bronze Age collapse.
happen when I was strong.
But you go back in time and you find much larger catastrophic events, and then you can say, well, this could collapse an entire global civilization. It could destroy what was there before and do it drastically. Like, it doesn't take much, and the stronger the catastrophe,
That's really
the
cool, you
less that is
Dolphin.
left
Thanks,
over.
man.
That's right.
Yeah.
And within there's got to be a threshold.
You warmed my
somewhere.
heart tonight.
If we look at local disasters, like, you know, like I think about a good example might be Hurricane Katrina when it struck. Was that 2011? It struck New Orleans. 2005. Yeah. Okay,
That's the
that
thing,
one.
man. Everyone has a
So
story, right?
2005. You know, New Orleans is still not recovered fully from that. But what allowed the recovery of it was the fact that there was intact, the rest of the continent was intact infrastructure. Now, if you take
That's why I'm
Katrina
sharing
and just
it.
use that as your measuring stick, and you go, okay,
Because
well, we can bring in
Other
a few
people's
billion
head
dollars worth
injury
of resources from
inspired me
other areas of society that are still fully functioning and intact.
on YouTube.
But what if we go an order of magnitude or more greater than that? What if we had 10 cities that all suffered the kind of degree of devastation as New Orleans did in 2005? Well, like I said, New Orleans is still not fully recovered. But if we did 10 times
But
worse
it's
than
like,
that,
man,
and now that much resources has to be marshaled, and
when
obviously
you're
the
lifting
resource base
weights, when
that
you're
would be
lifting a
used for
weight,
the
it
recovery
doesn't
is gonna be
matter
spread much thinner. What happens if you
what
have
you've been
two
through.
orders? What if you have
It doesn't
100?
matter your
What if you have
history.
100?
Doesn't matter
Where do you get to
how
the
much of
point
a victim
where,
you make
you know,
yourself.
now recovery essentially has been reset
It's
almost
either
to
like
zero,
binary. It's like,
rather than
will you lift this weight or
you
not?
know,
Yes or
obviously
no?
the damage suffered by
Do
New
you have the
Orleans wasn't-
strength,
we
the
didn't
desire?
have that damage here in Atlanta.
So that
didn't
was
have it
really
up, you
big
know,
for my
out in
recovery
Houston
to not
or,
enter like a state of
Yeah.
victim.
wherever, right? You
Yeah,
get
there's
my
a
point.
threshold. Yeah, there's a threshold at which
Which was
civilization
really,
doesn't really recover
Yeah,
easy
that's what
to
I'm getting
do.
at.
by using other
But
civilizations.
again, I got
It
really
just has to
lucky.
start over from scratch.
It could have
It
been
has
way
to start
worse.
over from scratch.
I
Yeah.
could have become a real
And maybe
victim.
the other thing I thought of that with Katrina is, like, you know, hurricanes also come in swarms.
Yeah.
So
Right.
just doing
Yes,
something
they do.
objective like
Right,
lifting,
it would be silly to
lifting
look
weights
at,
is one of
you
the
know,
most
if
objective
you were
thing
some
you can do.
future
That
archaeologist
happened
and
like
you looked at
math.
two cities that were sort of distant from each other, but both on the coast, that had been destroyed in the same
And it's
year.
it's
by
kind of
like high
refreshing
winds and
because
water, and you were
you
like,
do
well, this must
something
have
that
been
has
human
no
activity 'cause
emotion in it.
a hurricane can't be
You
this
push
big,
through the emotion because the emotions they
right? Implying
Right,
you don't
right.
know that hurricanes
they literally
can occur
just
in storms. They
dissolve when
happen over
you're
a period
when you gotta
of
wait on
time
top of
within the
you,
year,
right?
and you can have multiple hurricanes impacting.
Because your thoughts,
Yeah.
Just like you can have multiple
the
impactors,
only thing you
multiple
think about
earthquakes.
is lifting the weight because you have
Right. Right.
Yeah.
because you're like maxing out.
So this is
So that
from
helped a lot.
2009. This is
So
the
my
Journal of
mind,
Environmental Geology. The title
my,
is
obviously
Documentary
my
Evidence
body too, but man,
on Weather Conditions and a Crisis
Just
in
to not
1315
be a
to
victim.
1317. So bringing it even closer to our own time. So
be like, I
this
am
is
not
that transition
disabled.
now. Think about early 1300s. We're looking at the transition from medieval warm period phasing into, this is the first phase of the Little Ice Age. So climatic conditions of
I
the
got
Middle
really lucky
Ages
with my
is the subject
brain.
of several research papers, either as
They did
long-term
tests on me.
investigations or in
Actually, they
the
sent
form
me to
of
like
case
Toronto
studies
rehab because
on
it was at work. It was a
extreme
work
events.
accident, so I had some pretty.
Being
I
already
was in
part of the Little
Toronto,
Ice Age, the 14th
so I had like
century
top
is still
level
considered as a transition
rehabilitation,
between the medieval warm epoch
and they did
and
mental
the Little
tests on
Ice
me,
Age.
and my memory was
And this period
solid,
poses several
and
questions
my math and
concerning
everything was still very good,
variabilities
which
of
is
climate.
like miraculous.
A number of investigators pointed out that during this century, temperatures in Western and Central Europe started to decrease. In the Alps, the Aletsch Glacier started to advance from the 1120s and reached its maximum at around 1350, which can be related to the decrease in temperature in the Alps from the second half of the 12th century to the 14th century.
Why?
In this period, temperature decreased and also wet years became
I'm so
more
sick of
frequent,
playing this
especially in the Western European territories. From the 13th century,
I'm so sick of
the
playing this
number
level.
of climatic extremes increased in
God.
Western Europe, and so did the number of sea
I'm not.
floods in the
I love
northwestern
it.
European region. The second decade of the 14th century gained special attention among climate scientists. Now, this is something that we actually can now buttress this insight from all kinds of evidence that the transitions from warm to cold, that encompasses some of the greatest climatic extremes now in the record. The transitions from cold back to warm, but not nearly so much as the transitions into the cold phase. So the 1310s was the decade in which multiple years without summer occurred. In the mid-1310s, a serious famine took place all over Europe. In England, for example, unfavorable weather conditions started from 1314 with precipitation increase and temperature decrease. According to Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie in 2004, in the year 1316, 3 million people died because of the lack of food. Now, this, of course, is coming right on the heels, like within a decade of 300 years of warm climate. It saw, you know, like we've talked about, the proliferation, the growth of society, the extension of human lifespans, the enlargement of human stature, the decrease in infant mortality, and the enough wealth and riches in resources that they could build all of the great Gothic cathedrals.
Yeah, the cathedrals.
And is it any coincidence that the end of the 1200s is when you see this incredible phase of cathedral building pretty much ending? Exactly
Because
when
lifting
the
weights,
climate
the
goes
weights
shifts from
don't
medieval
care
warm
about
to-
your history.
What would happen?
They don't
What would
care
3
about your
million
past.
people
They don't care
do
about
to
your
the labor
injury.
pool in Europe? 3 million
They don't
people
care
dying
about
of
your
starvation. Now, if you have
self-made
3 million
victim
people dying of
disability.
starvation, that doesn't mean that the rest of the
All
people
that
were fat and
matters
happy.
is
No,
gravity
they're
and whether
probably,
you can
you know,
lift it or
suffering
not.
through it. You know, they
It's amazing.
survived,
It's
but
the best.
you can see right there what's going to happen to the labor pool that's now engaged in undertaking all these magnificent enterprises like the cathedral.
And an apparent loss of some technical skills too, right? Isn't there glass in some of those cathedrals that nobody is sure how it was
Yes.
made? So even that, you know, the
my
cold
God.
and the famine results in a loss of technology.
Yeah.
that still hasn't been recovered.
Oh
Yeah.
wow.
So then this is from another seminal work by Jean M. Grove, who actually wrote a whole book on the Little Ice Age. And I think her stuff was sort
Holy
of,
shit,
or-
dude.
Yeah, I don't remember. Anyways, I read the book years and years ago, probably
No
30 years ago.
way.
But then
I'm
I
so
got
sorry, man.
these quotes are from that book, and
That's so fast.
this is again 1988.
Just stand there.
and
You
the
probably
author,
froze.
Jean M. Grove is
Or you
saying,
thought he was gonna
quote,
break or
"Common
something. Anyways, I'm
behavioral
not judging what
feature
you're thinking.
of nearly all the world's glaciers is their
Broke your
recession
foot and
over
arm.
the last 100 years or more.
Minor
Or
bone
more.
in
So
your jaw.
really, as we've talked
Wow,
about, the
bro.
glaciers, the swollen glaciers
Were you
of the Little
conscious?
Ice
Did you
Age
stay conscious the
began
whole time?
receding a century before any
Holy shit,
significant
dude.
fossil fuel contribution to the
Yeah, Baton
atmosphere
Rouge, man.
by a human
Louisiana.
activity.
I've never
Okay?
been. I want to go.
So that's important. Again,
I
a
want to
fact
drive
that's
down.
generally ignored in all of this
Passed
discussion.
out. Wow.
Okay, the exceptions are relatively
Holy
few
shit,
and
dude.
can
That's
usually
exactly
be
what
explained
happened.
in
Yeah, I
terms of
passed
special
out too. In a
circumstances
coma.
of some kind.
Holy shit, dude.
Such
That's
as the occurrence
crazy.
of unusually heavy debris cover on ice tongues.
You probably don't
or
even. Do you
exceptional
remember?
accumulation
I don't. Yeah.
conditions. However,
I
the
don't
scale
remember.
and ubiquity of the recession is
don't
comparable
remember
with
anything.
that of the advance that seems to have taken place.
I mean, I
in
remember
so many
now,
parts
like
of the
things,
world.
but I mean, I don't
And
remember
that was
my injury at all, like
referring
the
to the second
getting
phase
hit or
of
whatever,
the Little Ice Age,
hitting the.
which occurred around
Yeah,
1600.
'cause I fell
and
off the
lasted
back
for
of my
about
work truck.
250 years.
And then the drum
Okay, these
fell on my
events
head
can be seen
from
at
the
this
back of
distance
the
in
truck.
time as bracketing the Little Ice Age.
from the lift gate.
The importance of the climatic factor in history has been
Yeah, it was
minimized
pretty. Yeah, it's a
by some
miracle I'm
20th
alive.
century historians and historical geographers. They have been working
It's a
in the
miracle
more
I'm alive.
prosperous parts of Europe and America during a period when history, like
sounds
many
like
other
you too,
fields, has
man.
become
Holy
more
shit, dude.
specialized. And moreover, in a period during the first half of the century
Did
when climate was
what
somewhat more
happened? Did
benign
they
and
they call an
dependable
ambulance
than
for
it
you?
had been earlier
Were you with
or has
friends?
been since. The broad
'Cause I was at
overview
work,
has not been fashionable,
And work called
but
me an
such
ambulance.
synthesis is needed.
saved
Technological
my
advance
life.
and sophistication of the economic structures of society
If I was on
provide
site and
important
that happened, I
buffers
would have died.
against the immediate
would've.
impact of
100%.
climate. Now, this is an important point right here.
Because
I'll
you're
say it
alone
again,
on
'cause it's
site.
extremely important. Technological advance and sophistication of the
Holy shit,
economic
dude! This is a
structures of
crazy
society
conversation we're
provide
having, man.
important buffers against the immediate impact of climate, and in this case, we could say climate change, right? So now, if we consider
Holy shit, dude!
that we are going to adopt a series of strategies, economic and social and cultural and scientific
So
strategies.
what happened? Did someone
industrial
call an ambulance for
strategies
you?
that are based upon the assumption of a steady state society, that a steady state climate that's only affected by human
Did the
activity,
guy drive off, or the woman
as
drive
opposed
off?
to a model that now recognizes that it's an extremely dynamic climate totally on its own and is going
Not
to
a
continue
rare
to be that way
occurrence.
regardless of what
I've heard
we
that
do.
happen before. That happened to a
What's
friend of
going to
mine.
happen? We have to now look at what kind of technological advance and sophistication is going to allow us to provide those buffers or to compromise those buffers. And I think the conclusion that is becoming really overwhelmingly apparent is that the kind of remediation measures
Wow, you
now
have the
being
video,
proposed
dude.
would mitigate the effectiveness of bumpers against immediate
That's
impact
crazy.
of climate change and leave us more
Have you
vulnerable
seen it? That should give you
to
closure
the kinds
on
of
it.
things that are going to happen naturally,
I don't have video of
irrespective
mine
of what we do and whether we
because
adopt
work.
you know,
I don't think
carbon
they have
passports
video.
or not.
I don't think unless they have video of the
Is
backyard,
the
maybe.
climate now
But
going to quit changing if we adopt
you don't want to see it.
carbon passports?
Holy
Now,
shit!
buildings can be going on here. Buildings can be heated, roads and railways kept open, and foods in short supply imported from elsewhere, so long as these are available. Although Western Europe and North America are currently in a position of surplus food production,
Man, I took that photo.
deficiencies exist elsewhere. The agricultural revolution
5
since the
minutes
Second
coming
World
out of the
War,
coma.
generated by plant breeding and selection with increased use of fertilizers, led for a time to the assumption that
After
that
my
weather
the brain
changes were
hemorrhaging
no
kind
longer
of
of
settled
importance.
down, and
this
I woke up.
complacency was shaken
I took that
by the
selfie.
severity of the cooler years of the 1970s. Now, this is very important because a lot of younger people who do not remember, who were not around during the 1970s, don't
Holy
remember the scare
shit.
about the
No
possibility
fucking
of a
way.
little ice age. And as I've explained, there was actually more merit and credibility to the fear of a little ice age than there
And
is
then
to
when
the
did you
fear of
wake
global
up?
warming. And there was 2 reasons for that. One,
In the ambulance?
1970s is when we came up
That's
with
when I woke up.
the evidence that these climate changes had
And
been
then I passed out again, and
extremely
then I woke up
fast,
24 hours later.
you know, in the past, past ice ages, that things happened in, you know, a century or a few decades or even literally a few years or less, right?
Sorry, man.
And so we've now realized that the length of a period equivalent to the Holocene in the record, we don't have any evidence of anything going much beyond 10,000 years, right? I even have a quote here. I think it's coming up in a slide where they're talking about exactly that. Okay, so the problem then is, okay, we're going, well, wait a second, look at these previous periods of time that we thought were tens of thousands of years long that were equivalent to our own. Well, it turns out they're way shorter, way more brief than we had thought they were. In fact, look at the longest we see prior to our own now is roughly 10,000 years, and we've exceeded that probably by a millennia or two. Now, at the same time, that 1930s, 1940s climatic warming that came right in the wake of the ending of the Little Ice Age, that was coming to an end. And you can actually look at the climate data and you see that the trend line is going up from the early 20th century right up
Holy
until the
crap,
late
man.
60s, early 70s. It then goes down until the late 1980s. So
Are you back?
there's another important point here. When we look
Thanks
at
for
so
being
much
here.
of the baseline of the modern global warming predictions,
So when did you
they
wake
go
up? I
back
woke up
30 years.
in the
So you go back
ambulance
30 years,
and
you're now in the
24
late
hours
ni-
later
You're in the early 90s.
in the hospital.
So now what's happened? You've come to this, you've gone right back to this point where the trend line, now that inflection point, where the trend line, which has been going down from the 1970s through the 1980s, it's now trending back up again. So if you went another 20 or 25 or 30 years before 1990 or the late 80s, well, what you're then going to see is the cooling. But by clipping that record in the early 90s, now all you get is an upward trend. You see, and it's
Yeah, you
deceiving.
started living.
It's not a real depiction
I started to
of
just
climate
record
change on
everything
a
like
long
me
enough
streaming
scale of time to make
and making
sense out of
YouTube
it.
videos and recording.
So
That's
it goes
me.
on here, referring to the cool years of the 1970s. And of course, it turned out that the fear
'Cause imagine
of
if I just
the
passed
return
away,
of a little
man.
ice age was unfounded at that time. However, is it unfounded to completely? Is it
It's
worthy
like
to
now
completely
I film
dismiss
everything.
the idea
I
of another
stream
phase?
everything.
Let's say a phase 3
I
of the
try
little
to
ice age.
publish it as much as I can.
Because what would happen is another phase of the Little Ice Age, where we have, you know, multiple, say, years without
Before
summer.
my injury, I didn't have very much, like a
Presently,
video
yeah, we could
and
weather
streaming
that.
and stuff.
We
I
could.
didn't do that.
But some of the measures that are being proposed are going to make it a whole lot more difficult. If we're preparing society for what we think is going to be a warmer world, and we go back into a cooler world, well, see, we ain't going to be prepared for that. So this is what it goes on. It is now recognized that the more efficiently farming is organized to make optimum use of normal weather conditions, the more sharply
Oh my god,
production
no
is likely
way.
to
That's
fall
you? That's the
if
video
the
of you,
climate
dude.
deviates markedly
It's basically
from
what
this
happened to
assumed
you. Okay,
norm.
okay.
If crop varieties are bred
Thanks,
to
man.
thrive in a narrow range of temperature and weather
Yeah, I mean,
conditions,
no, yeah.
they may give poorer yields than their predecessors if the actual conditions are outside this range. It is
But
the
don't
climatic
paste any,
implications
like,
of
violent
increased carbon dioxide concentrations
like
in the
YouTube links
atmosphere
on my stream.
that
Thanks, I know.
currently
I know what you mean, though. It's
exercise
probably, I know what
most
you mean.
of the climatic
But,
immunity.
Wow.
And of course,
No,
what
the
was
video's
true in the
important
late 80s, when
because
this was written,
you need
is way
closure.
more true now, right? But here's the point that the author goes on to make, and this is the
Because you're
important
not,
point.
you're not really like
And I
sitting
don't
there
know whether this is
wondering
true or
and
not, but
thinking
it
about
certainly,
it. And it's like, oh,
as
I
it
wonder
says
what
here,
it
is a
was like, whatever.
possibility.
Just like your body and everything.
It is
The
possible
sounds.
that such man-induced
You need
changes,
like
like a
closure
warming
on it.
caused by increased amounts of carbon dioxide, it is
Just
possible
also
that
just kind of
such
just to be
man-induced
aware of
changes
actually what
help
happened.
to bring the Little Ice
That's
Age to an
why.
end. And that the global
Like, I'm
rise in
glad you were
temperature
really,
since the middle of the
you
last
said the
century has been
details. You
caused
broke your
by
jaw
these
and your
increased
arm and
concentrations.
your foot.
The fact
Like,
remains
those are
that a small
details.
but
That's
distinct
like
temperature fall
huge.
affected large parts of the globe in the 1960s and 1970s, but this
Like,
occurred
moving
despite
truck, Jesus
increasing
Christ.
carbon dioxide concentrations. So now we have several things to think about there. Think about this.
Holy fuck,
Right after
man.
World War II, you know, when car culture spread and urbanization spread, and
Wow.
there was a huge
Hey
uptick
man, you
in
inspire me,
the
dude.
amount of fossil fuel
That story?
consumption coming out of World War II.
That's
that
crazy.
then, of course, led to the introduction of
Well, I'm
large
glad
amounts of
you're
carbon
not
dioxide into the atmosphere.
suicidal
that
now.
occurred at the
Glad
end
you're
of
living
and in
life,
the
enjoying
post-World
life, you know?
War II environment.
Just enjoy life, man.
Nobody,
If you
not
skate,
even the
skate.
most
Love
you
it,
know,
man.
hardcore promoters of global warming maintain that,
I
that
skate, but
prior
I'm
to
not very
World War
good.
II, there was enough human-introduced carbon dioxide in the atmosphere,
But I love
only
it.
because the fluctuations that had been the pre-industrial fluctuations, there was evidence to show that those pre-industrial fluctuations in
And like I want to
ambient
do it and be
concentrations
alive to do it.
at least it equaled, maybe exceeded the shift in carbon dioxide concentration as a consequence of burning fossil fuel. So basically, post World War II, now we've got all of this. The carbon dioxide is going up. We'd think that at that point we should also see a corresponding
Holy shit,
warming,
dude.
but it's not what we see.
So you
What
had
we
like
see is
no,
exactly when
you were just
carbon
pretty much on
dioxide
your
went up
own.
for the first quarter century. Temperature was cooler.
What did the driver do?
Now, that's
Did the
never been
driver drive
explained.
away?
Okay.
Did the driver
Then obviously, apparently, there's
try to
not
give
a
you money?
one-to-one linear relationship between
What
increase in
happened?
carbon dioxide and increase in
drove
temperature.
away?
Right? But that's another one of these facts that's conveniently
That's a
ignored.
whole nother level of
Anyways, the
psychological
cooling, this
effect
cooling was, as we
in
have
the
seen,
healing process.
this cooling during the 60s and
'Cause yeah,
70s,
that happened to a
70s
friend of ours.
was sufficient to have marked biological effects and to influence agricultural production
she
in
was, like,
high
pissed.
latitudes, and even to have
And she was
political
all fucked up
consequences.
and
A
angry.
reversion to
So like
the
her, she
climatic
wasn't,
conditions of the
her
Little
stress
Ice
level,
Age
her wasn't
is
allowing
perhaps
her to
less
heal.
likely now than it would have
And she
been,
was old. It
but
was
for
really
the burning
fucked
of
up.
fossil fuels over
So the
the last few
emotional
decades.
thing is huge.
But it might be wise not to assume that a return
Especially
to
in
Little
the
Ice
healing.
Age conditions is entirely
Especially
out
at the
of the
start.
question. And one could, and I think, didn't we look at some slides recently looking at some of the previous warm periods? We did look at a slide, didn't we? Showing the average near surface temperature of the northern hemisphere during the past 11,000 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did, so I don't need to pull that up again. But what you saw was
But it's fucked,
that
man. There's nothing
the
you can do
modern
for head
warm
injuries.
period
Like there's
was
nothing you can do.
maybe not even
You
as
just
warm as the
monitor.
medieval warm period,
Right.
which
Otherwise,
was
it's
not
just
as
like
warm as the
fucked.
Roman climatic optimum, and certainly not as warm as the Holocene climatic optimum, which happened in 2 phases. And yeah, so that was a very interesting period of time, is that Holocene warm period.
Well, we got to wrap it up here for tonight, Randall.
Oh, but I'm just getting warmed
You
up.
just getting started? Getting
I'm just getting
Randall
started.
warming?
This is, yeah, this is.
It's a hockey stick. And bam, right at the end. Shoots up.
Well, so what we'll do, I want to get into talking about some of these guys like Hubert Lamb and Herman Sloan, and we've talked about them before, but, you know, they were the guys who basically founded the modern science of climatology, and they were the ones publishing and doing their research before the whole issue of
wow.
climate change and global warming became
No
politicized.
way.
So it's very
So
interesting
we
to look
stopped.
at what they had to say back 25,
Holy
30,
shit, dude,
40
that's
years
crazy.
ago, what they were learning in the 80s and the early 90s and
Dude,
things.
you want it?
You know, and
You
then
know what's a great video that came out?
address the questions of the modern
FP in
warming
Souls on
narratives in the
Thrasher.
context
It just
of what
came
they
out.
were saying
They go to
before
Puerto Rico.
the science was being contaminated by politics.
One sec, let me
All right, sounds good.
By
Alright,
the
one
way,
second.
Gene Grove was a
Check-
British
check out that
physical
video. It's a
geographer
great
and
video.
glaciologist known
came
for
out like
her
a week ago.
comprehensive study of climate change in the Little Ice Age across the world.
Yes.
I just want to note what you were saying about the so-called cooling trend of the 70s. I do remember those articles. They weren't fringe articles. Newsweek, Wall Street Journal,
That's right.
the major
right.
publications were
Time.
running articles on this idea of global cooling.
Yeah.
Concurrently, there was speculation. There were articles about the coming population crisis, facing imminent starvation. You know, food crops.
I remember,
that
like-
agriculture was not going to be able to keep up.
Right.
So-
I remember reading like books like The Population Bomb
Right,
by Paul Ehrlich
right.
and getting kind of freaked out about it, but then I kind of forgot about it because I had more important things on my mind, like,
Right.
Do
you
you
know,
think that was just it was like, seems like it could have been just a learning that, like, they learned, like, oh, this is powerful. We can scare people with this and get things done.
Well, that's an interesting
like-
thought.
Like, there may have been, like you were saying, there may have been some evidence for possible global cooling. It didn't end up happening, but
Right.
you know, it was like some legitimate science. And then they saw how freaked out it made people, and they're like,
sure.
ah.
What? Yeah. Hell yeah.
I mean, that's my conspiracy guy coming in.
Well, the
My inner
conspiracy guy
conspiracy
might actually be onto something because they've certainly incorporated. I mean, if you look at the mechanics of propaganda, you can see it's all being invoked and wielded for the global warming thing.
Yeah.
And they've got now a whole generation of kids come up that don't have much more than a couple of decades of perspective. And so, you know, old farts like me and Mike, we've been around long enough to know that, well, wait a second. How different is it now than it was when we were kids? There were cold days, there were hot days, you know, there was all kinds of stuff going on. But, you know, if you don't have any long-term perspective, yeah, you might easily be led to believe, like so many younger people now, not the millennials and younger, is that, what is there, a new term, right, for the ones that are now coming of age?
What, the Zoomers?
The Zoomers.
Gen
The
Z?
Zoomers. Oh, yeah. Me and Mike, we're
In
boomers.
Louisiana, you could probably skate all
The
year
Zoomers are
round.
what?
There's
Turbo
there's
envious of
boomers
that.
and I don't remember. Then
I can't
you
keep
get
up.
to Gen X, then you get millennials. I'm a Gen X. Kyle's a graybeard millennial. He's like at the very earliest millennial, and then after that is Gen Z.
Gen Z.
The Zoomers.
The
they call 'em.
Zoomers. Okay. Well, so a lot of those Zoomers
I
are
see, I
really
don't know if we're gonna get a lot of
getting
rain on the
hysterical over,
way.
you know, they're like, I turned on NPR a few days ago, and I guess I won't get into a big diatribe because we got to go. But they're on there. What they're doing is they're
Yeah, but
interviewing
here it's like,
all these
oh, okay,
ladies, young ladies,
time to
in
put
their
your
early
board away
20s who
for
decided not
3,
to have
4
children
months
because
straight.
of global warming, because of climate
Yeah,
change.
they think that the world will not be able to sustain.
And then when it's cold,
Yeah.
when it's
them
like
or their kids.
freezing cold, your trucks
seen-
just
I've seen
work
that.
different.
And
Your
they've been-
bearings suck
because
because
they've
it's
been
just
brainwashed.
freezing cold.
yes,
the
they've
metal,
been
like,
fed a constant
shrinks.
stream of doom porn.
Creaks.
Yeah.
Your bushings
yep.
creak.
I like that,
It's just
doom porn.
shit.
It's doom porn, straight up.
Well, that's something that,
5
you know,
days?
worth
Yeah,
of-
I can
worthy
believe
of
it.
further discussion because, you know, things are going on right now that I
Dang,
think
dude, I can
completely,
believe
you
it.
know, are going to completely, if not suppressed, launch us into an entirely new era of resource utilization that renders all of these old models, the
Please.
Malthusian-based older models, going back to, you know, the population bomb and all of that, just basically rendering those completely irrelevant and obsolete. But
Well, the Zoomers don't have anything to worry about because, according to the proceedings of the National Academy
Oh
of
no, that
Sciences,
sucks.
the Little Ice Age was caused by warming.
Yeah, I think it's El Nino.
So we'll be all right.
Changing of the jet stream.
So the global warming is going to cause
Jet
global
stream going
cooling,
way down.
and everything will be fine.
That's right.
Cool.
Or rather, way
Okay.
up.
As long as we,
No, way down, rather.
as long as we don't succumb to famine in the process, right?
Right. No, no. It can't get hot, Randall. That's dangerous.
Down, I mean.
But we should talk about the upside, which is constantly being confirmed every day. With agricultural surpluses, except that you saw the
Well, we have discussed it, like the greening of the planet, the
Yeah.
more CO2, like longer warm periods is, you have
Yes.
wider food belts. Yeah,
Well, you yourself said here, a number of episodes back about greenhouses
yeah.
and, ramping up the concentrations of CO2 in a greenhouse. What does that do to the productivity of the plants?
It massively
It
increases
kills
it.
them.
Well, yeah, I mean, up to a point, there's some point at which the carbon dioxide would be too much. But considering that in most of Earth history, it's been 2 and 3
Oh,
times or
man,
4
dude.
times higher
Well,
than
thank you
now,
for sharing that story,
I
man.
don't think we're at that
So you were
threshold
just by
where we need to be
yourself?
worrying about we're going to die of
No
carbon
one did any
dioxide poisoning, like
memory
what happened to
tests
that
or
lake in
anything? Did you go to the
Cameroon.
doctor?
You
You
remember
must have
that?
gone to the doctor and had
When there was that
those.
volcanic eruption
Oh,
and it
yeah.
spewed out, and yeah.
Wow.
That's an interesting story in itself. Now that's what's happened when you get up to like 10,000 parts per million or something.
And we've done that in our winery, and it is can be disorienting.
Oh, you have. So what were you
Yes,
doing?
Ninja Lifestyle
Scientific
did
test?
When you're fermenting, and especially when you have a bunch
Ninja
of very
Lifestyle
large vats in a
did a,
small-ish base, and it's
Uh-huh.
fermenting, it's making tons of CO2. So I brought my CO2 meter there so that we could read the
a review of
concentrations in the
that
winery, 'cause it
video,
can
but
get
the
really hot.
video.
And many
So
times
follow
the
Ninja
meter
Lifestyle.
would just give an error, and that error happens when it's 10,000 ppm or above,
And
right? It
Yeah.
can't, it can't tell you, and like yes, you would get lightheaded, and you had to go outside, can't stay in there long. Yeah,
he's a
This
sick
last year, I
skateboarder.
couldn't even hardly walk in there.
yeah.
I had to, go in just long enough to open the door, the big bay door.
Right.
But it was,
Yeah,
Anyways,
But
And
you
it's-
can
and
you can
alcohol
test.
fumes as well doesn't help.
Yeah, right. And but you've been in greenhouses that were 1,100, 1,200 parts per million,
that's crazy,
Yeah,
man.
yes.
and you were just
1200, yeah.
fine.
Right. You don't even
You were
notice.
just fine.
Yeah.
Right.
well, even in the winery, when it was down at like 4,000 or 6,000,
Yeah,
it was fine.
You're okay, but once
Yeah.
it gets upwards of 10,000, you start to notice. Yeah.
And that number is completely and totally unrealistic as far as
Right.
you know.
Atmosphere.
I mean,
and
how
guess
many
what?
how many
It was
tons of
still cold in the winery. Just like
Yeah.
it didn't get really hot.
Well, if you'd stayed in there, what did you measure to see what wavelength of radiation Kyle was emitting?
Right.
If he was, maybe he wasn't emitting the long enough
Proper
wavelengths
wavelength.
of, right, to get trapped. Oh, you're going to need to do that next time to make
Okay.
this scientifically viable.
Okay.
Okay, well, it was fun, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great show.
That was great.
Yeah, I learned a lot about the sun.
The double duck.
Coming next time. Yeah, great stuff.
Well,
More.
okay, the final thing, since you said that, Brad.
Oh no, Brad.
I mean, now what role? Yeah, I mean, the role of absolutely implicit in everything we're talking about here. The sun is also part of that integrated model, a big part of it. So,
It's out
Yes.
there every day.
yep.
Always on fire.
Okay.
Well, Dalton, I'm glad
All right,
Randall
guys.
Carlson-
that you
randallcarlson.com.
persisted
Sign up for the
and
newsletter. Check for
are
information
in
on
good
tours.
health today.
There's everything you need there. All the Randall you can handle. All right, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, this show will come out 4 months from now, so hopefully people will have figured out that HowTube is back up.
Okay.
Man,
Ouch.
talking about this is making me think
Alright.
about my head
Good
injury
night, guys.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Wait, wait.
and the miracle of the event. It's just so absurd. You inspire me, man. What, like what? Why? Oh my god.
In a tomb deep underground, archaeologists carefully remove the lid from an ancient stone sarcophagus.
Over half of all animals in the open ocean, thousands of a Sally Lightfoot crab.
This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.
The fate of the planets is intricately tied with that of the star that they orbit. So for our own...
This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.
It was the year 628. The emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Heraclius, had much to celebrate. He had pulled off a stunning victory and had saved his people when it seemed that all hope was lost. Now the fortunes of his empire had waxed and waned. Indeed, under one of his predecessors, the Emperor Justinian, the Eastern Romans, who would one day be referred to as the Byzantine, had achieved greatness in their landholdings in what was referred to as the Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. But since that time, misfortune had descended. The empire was engulfed in internal dissension, massive political upheaval, and was beset on all sides by determined and aggressive enemies. John Julius Norwich, in his A Short History of Byzantium, a mere 400 pages long, explains the situation that Heraclius stepped into at the beginning of his reign. Quote, "At the age of 36, fair-haired and broad-chested, Heraclius must have appeared something of a demigod when he stepped out of the palace, his young wife on his arm. Yet, there were surely many of his subjects who feared that he might be the last emperor of Byzantium. Never had any of his predecessors inherited so desperate a situation. To the west, the Avars and the Slavs had overrun the Balkans. To the east, the Persian watchfires were clearly visible at Chalcedon, immediately across the Bosphorus. True, the Theodosian walls were in good repair, and the Persians had no ships by which to cross the straits. But though the capital was secure, the provinces were falling away. The year after Heraclius' ascension, the Persians had seized Antioch. In 613, they added Damascus, and in 614, Jerusalem. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was burnt to ashes, the true cross was seized. The Persians then turned their attention to taking Egypt, and before long, the chief source of the empire's corn had become a Persian province. Famine and pestilence soon followed." End quote. In 622, after initially suffering major setbacks, Heraclius began a series of military campaigns that stabbed deep into the Persian Empire. Within 6 years, he had concluded several successful campaigns. His forces had smashed Persian armies, had won a decisive victory at the Battle of Nineveh in 627, and soon Heraclius had his men take up position near the Persian capital, Ctesiphon. The Persian king, Khosrau II, was overthrown and some say murdered by his own son, Kavad II, who, recognizing the extremely poor situation that he was in, immediately sued for peace. The lost lands in Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor were restored to the Romans. Jerusalem was once again in Christian hands, and the true cross was returned. An end to hostilities could not have come at a better time. The Byzantine and the Persian empires, which some historians have referred to as the eyes of the known world, had battled one another into sheer exhaustion. But this prolonged and destructive war was further complicated by major famine and then plague, the effect of which reduced both empires to a shadow of their prior strength. However, this peace that they had shed so much blood for was not to last, for a new power was about to enter the world stage. Far to the south of these two great empires, in the deserts of Arabia, a people who were essentially disregarded as nothing more than simple barbarians, a military annoyance at best, had united together into one of the most formidable fighting forces, and they were now poised to unleash one of the greatest conquests the world had ever seen. John Norwich gives us the unfolding story. Quote, "On September 14th in the year 628, Heraclius entered his capital in triumph. Before him went the true cross behind 4 elephants, the first ever seen in Constantinople. Though still only in his middle 50s, he looked old and ill. But if he had worn himself out, he had done so in the service of empire. Thanks to him, Persia would never again threaten Byzantium. The procession threaded its way to St. Sophia. During the Thanksgiving service that followed, the true cross was slowly raised up until it stood vertical before the high altar. It was perhaps the most moving moment in the history of the great church, and many saw it as a sign that a new golden age was about to dawn. Alas, it proved to be nothing of the kind. Just 6 years before, in September 622, the year Heraclius had launched his Persian expedition, the prophet Muhammad had fled from hostile Mecca to friendly Medina, thereby initiating the Muslim era. And by 633, the armies of Islam would begin the advance that was to take them in the course of a single century to within 150 miles of Paris and to the very gates of Constantinople. End quote. The very next year, in 629, Heraclius was on pilgrimage to Jerusalem to place the true cross back in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. While he was making his journey, a letter reached him. Now, the contents of this letter cannot be reliably confirmed, and by some accounts, the entire encounter could simply be a myth. But if it is to be believed, it read, "In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and the most merciful, this letter is from Muhammad, his apostle, to Heraclius, the ruler of the Romans. Peace be upon the followers of Gyges. I invite you to surrender to Allah. Embrace Islam, and Allah will bestow on you a double reward. But if you reject his invitation, you will be misguiding your people." Heraclius had no idea where this threat was coming from, but he was soon to find out. Nearly 20 years before, in the year 610, a man named Muhammad, soon to be considered by his people as the messenger of God, was regarded to have received divine revelations. Albert Hourani, in his History of the Arab Peoples, gives one account of what happened. Quote, "He became a solitary wanderer among the rocks, and then one day, perhaps when he was about 40 years old, something happened. Some contact with the supernatural, known to later generations as the Night of Power or Destiny. In one version, an angel seen in the form of a man on the horizon called to him to become the messenger of God. He heard the angel's voice summoning him to recite, and he asked, 'What shall I recite?' End quote. According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad then became the prophet of God. Being illiterate himself, he committed the words he recited to memory, and in time these words were written down by others to create the Quran, which the very name itself means to recite. This was to be the holy book of a new religion, that of Islam. The prophet began to preach his divine Islamic revelation. His discourse attracted both a following of people and the disdain of the entrenched religious establishment. This came to a breaking point in the year 622, the same year Heraclius was about to initiate his great campaigns against the Persians. It was that year that the prophet Muhammad fled with his supporters from Mecca to the city of Medina, a journey that would be known as the Hijra and marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Once in Medina, Muhammad established a stronghold and gained a powerful following. 8 years later, when he was sufficiently well-funded and reinforced, he returned and conquered Mecca in 630. Upon hearing of this conquest and the words that he preached, the quarreling and disunited tribes of Arabia began to flock to his banner. Under Islam, they were united and instilled with a fierce resolve to expand their domain. Indeed, by the time of his death in 632, Muhammad had brought nearly all of Arabia under his control. But it was his immediate successors, known as the Rashidun Caliphs, or the rightly guided, that would elevate the Islamic conquest to a new level. By the early 630s, Arab forces, now well-disciplined and organized, ventured out from the great deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Now at first, these were no more than simple raids or skirmishes into Mesopotamia and Syria, but soon it became an all-out invasion. It was not long until both the beleaguered and exhausted empires of the Eastern Romans and the Persians came under full attack. After the fall of Damascus and much of the Levant to Arabian armies in 634, Heraclius decided to assemble a large army to confront this new and rather unexpected threat. The Persians, who were equally caught off guard by the Arabian onslaught and reeling from several defeats, did exactly the same thing. In a somewhat rare event, the Romans and the Sasanian Persians decided to focus their militaries on their common enemy rather than each other. In the critical year of 636, the Byzantine and the Persian forces engaged the Caliphate in two separate major battles. At the Battle of Yarmouk in August, the Byzantine army was utterly destroyed. A sandstorm had blinded them just as a well-timed Arabian cavalry charge crushed their flank. A few months later, in November, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the Persian army was equally annihilated when their general was slain on the field of battle and morale collapsed. The path was now open for the armies of Islam to continue their conquest. To the east, the armies of the Caliphate now poured into Persia. They traversed the Zagros Mountains and pursued the Persian armies across the Iranian plateau, eventually taking the culturally and militarily important city of Isfahan in 642. That same year, the Sassanid king Yazdegerd III deployed a massive army to stop the invaders. But at the Battle of Nahavand, the warriors of the Rashidun Caliphate, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1, pulled off a decisive victory. The Persian army was destroyed, and with its destruction, the Sasanian Persian Empire began to collapse. But the Persian spirit was still strong, and it would take the Arabs until 651 to complete their conquest. However, by that time, the King of Kings, Yazdegerd III, was reduced to a beggar, wandering the wilderness. And if the story of his death is to be believed, he was betrayed and murdered by a common miller while simply looking for food. The Arab conquest of the East would continue, and by 750, the borders of the Caliphate would rest within the Indus River Valley, along the same frontier once seen by Alexander the Great. But the Persians were not alone in feeling the wrath of the Caliphate. To the west, the Romans would also watch their empire crumble. Fresh from their conquest of Mesopotamia and their stunning victories at both Yarmouk and Al-Qadisiyah, Arabian armies now also moved to the west and to the north. Gaza and Antioch were taken in 637, Jerusalem in 638. By 641, most of the Levant was in Muslim hands, and Syria had also fallen, forcing the Emperor Heraclius to lament, "Farewell, a long farewell to Syria, my fair province. Thou art an infidel's now. Peace be with you, O Syria. What a beautiful land you will be for the enemy's hands." The Caliph's men would push on into Armenia and then into Asia Minor. But here the forces of the Roman Emperor were at last able to slow them down. By the mid-7th century, a neutral zone of sorts was created along the breadth of the Tarsus Mountains. However, even as the grain fields of Anatolia were spared for the moment, a new front had already been opened. From their staging areas in the Levant, an Islamic force of a mere 4,000 was sent into Egypt in 639. Later, heavily reinforced, this army took the vital port city of Alexandria in 641 and the rest of Egypt the next year. From there, the Islamic conquest would continue along North Africa into the Maghreb. The ancient city of Carthage, which was razed to the ground at the end of the Third Punic War, and then resurrected by Julius Caesar 100 years later, was taken in 698. Tangier in modern-day Morocco was captured 2 decades later in 708. Now the Caliphate stretched from the Indus River Valley on one end to the Atlantic Ocean on the other. Edward Gibbon gives his account of the Muslim general named Aqba, who pushed the western borders of the Caliphate to the ocean. Quote, "The fearless Aqba plunged into the heart of the country, traversed the wilderness, and at length penetrated to the verge of the Atlantic and the Great Desert." The career, though not the zeal of Aqba, was checked by the prospect of a boundless ocean. He spurred his horse into the waves and, raising his eyes to heaven, exclaimed, Great God, if my course were not stopped by the sea, I would still go on to the unknown kingdoms of the West, preaching the unity of the holy name and putting to the sword any rebellious nations. End quote.
Oh, I might be done for tonight. Let's see. Let me just wash them and I'm gonna see. But I might be done.
What was once the Roman province of Hispania was then a Visigoth kingdom. However, it was on the verge of civil war and proved to be an easy target. It was rapidly overrun and became the Caliph's newest province, which the Arabs would call Al-Andalus. But despite losing so much land, it was perhaps the Caliphate's development of a navy that most sent chills into the Roman emperors. The great harbor of Alexandria in Egypt, along with several other major ports in the Levant, were now in the service of the Caliph. With an urge to continue the holy war on the water, a navy was constructed. However, it would be over a decade before these ships would be a serious challenge to the Eastern Romans. But once unleashed, this new Muslim navy would quickly prove itself. The island of Cyprus and then Rhodes fell to the Caliphate in 654. The loss of these two strategic islands prompted the Roman Emperor Constans II to launch his own fleet with the intent to intercept the Muslims. Off the coast of Asia Minor in late 655, the two forces met. At what would later be known as the Battle of the Masts, the Romans were decisively beaten, and the path to Constantinople was now laid open. However, a rapid advance on the city did not occur. In 661, civil war would come to the Caliphate. In what was known as the First Fitna, the Rashidun Caliphs were overthrown, and a new and very powerful dynasty was established, that of the Umayyad. The capital of the Caliphate was now moved to Damascus, where a new objective was determined. It was the dream of the first Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah, to finally conquer Constantinople. Roger Crowley expertly explains his conviction, quote, "The velocity of conquest was staggering, the ability to adapt extraordinary. Driven by the word of God and divine conquest, the people of the desert constructed navies to wage the holy war by sea. Finally, in 669, within 40 years of Muhammad's death, the Caliph Muawiyah dispatched a huge amphibious force to strike a knockout blow at Constantinople itself. On the wind of victory, he had every anticipation of success." End quote. The plans for this conquest were meticulous and designed with a long siege in mind. The Muslim navy was sent up past the Dardanelles to secure ports, dry dock facilities, and establish supply depots within the Sea of Marmara. The fleet would eventually serve to blockade Constantinople, slowly tightening their stranglehold. The armies of the Caliphate were then brought up and took up position to the east, within sight of the city on the Asian shore. More and more reinforcements arrived, and in 674, they established a formidable siege line along the western side of the city. But once again, the Theodosian walls were the saving grace of the Romans. The siege technology of the time was simply not adequate to breach these impressive fortifications, and the Muslim besiegers knew this. Now, the exact details of what happened next are still a bit unknown. Some claim that for the next 4 years, until 678, this was a continuous siege, whereas other sources state that the Umayyad adopted a containment strategy with multiple coordinated raids. Either way, had this continued, the city might have been taken. But at this point in history, the Byzantine had developed a new superweapon, and just as things turned out, they found themselves in a target-rich environment. In 678, the Byzantine fleet sailed from their safe harbor in the Golden Horn. The siege had been going on for 4 years, and so by this time, their spy network had revealed the logistical network of their enemy. They knew exactly where they were headed. Using extreme caution to maximize on the element of surprise, the fleet made its way to the main Umayyad naval base in the Sea of Marmara, which many believe to be the port city of Cyzicus. The ships were known as dromons. They were light and swift and manned by many oars. On board was a relatively new weapon, which its composition is still highly debated to this day. By some references, the Byzantine had come up with a way to store within a bronze container a mixture which mainly consisted of crude oil for its flammability and pine resin for its adhesive properties. But the true genius was that the Eastern Romans had figured out a way to effectively weaponize this mixture. Using a hand pump to build up pressure, the volatile mixture was forced through a movable hose or nozzle, and thus the attacker could maneuver it in whichever direction they wished. Now, just as the mixture came out, it was ignited by a flame into a jet of fiery death. This was medieval napalm, and the Droman was essentially a massive flamethrower. Later historians would refer to this as Greek fire and would debate its composition to this day. But what cannot be debated was its effect on the Muslim fleet, which was both quick and decisive. Rallying against flames, quote, "The explosion of flame was accompanied by a noise like
I'm done
thunder,
for tonight.
darkening
Thank
the
you.
sky,
Thank you for
and
being
steaming
here.
gas
Thank you,
suffocated
Dalton.
the
Thank you for your
terrified
story,
sailors on
bro.
the Arab ships. The firestorm seemed to defy the laws of nature.
Thank you
It
for
could be
sharing
directed
your story.
sideways or downward in whichever direction the operator wished.
I'm gonna read
When
somebody.
it touched the surface of the sea, the water ignited.
Maybe.
It seemed to have adhesive properties too, sticking to wooden hulls and masts and proving impossible to extinguish, so that the ships and their crews were rapidly engulfed in a propulsive torrent of fire that seemed like
might
the
not read
blast
anybody.
of an angry god. End quote. This
Might read
never
Ivory.
attack
Ivory's
was
online.
repeated again and again.
Let's do
The
it.
Umayyad fleet would be systematically hunted down and destroyed, and with its loss, their system of logistics was crippled. The besiegers
One
of
viewer?
Constantinople soon began to run out of
No,
food,
we're not reading
and in
Ivory.
time
One
the
viewer. We're
siege
just gonna
had to
sign
be
off.
lifted. But even
Thank
as
you.
the Muslims tried to make their way back, many of their remaining ships
You're the
were
best.
wrecked in a sudden storm.